Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. When I was 10 years old, I shared a room with my younger brother, who was 8 at the time. We had a bunk bed, the kind with a metal frame and a ladder that rattled when you climbed it. I slept on the top bunk, he took the bottom. We didn't have much space in the room. Just the bed, a small dresser we shared, and a closet with sliding doors that never seemed to stay shut. My parents' room was across the hallway, and the bathroom was right in between. At night, we kept the doors slightly open so a sliver of hallway light could help us find the bathroom without tripping over toys or stepping on Lego bricks. Our house wasn't old. It was a small one-story place in a quiet neighborhood. Not the kind of home people whisper stories about. But even new houses can feel strange in the dark. Pipes make noises, floors creak, and sometimes your own heartbeat is loud enough to spook you. Our room, for the most part, always felt normal during the day. It was just a place for sleeping, playing, arguing over toys. But at night, especially after the lights went out, it sometimes felt too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. This one night, it was late October, I remember that because the Halloween decorations were still up around the house. I woke up in the middle of the night. I didn't have a clock in the room, but it must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning. That deep part of the night, where everything is still and heavy. I woke up needing to pee. It wasn't urgent, but enough that I knew I wouldn't fall back asleep until I went. The bunk bed creaked when I shifted, and I lay still for a moment, listening to see if my brother stirred. He didn't. I could hear his slow breathing below me. I started to climb down the ladder. I moved slowly because our parents got pissed if we made too much noise at night. I was barefoot, and the cold metal rungs chill my feet. My left foot found the floor first, then my right. Just as I started to shift my weight and take a step toward the door, I felt something close around my ankle. It wasn't a tug, not right away. Just fingers, cool, firm fingers, wrapping around my ankle from under the bed. My first thought wasn't even fear. It was confusion. My body froze, and in that moment, a million thoughts ran through me. Was it my brother? But he was in the bed. Maybe he rolled under it, but I just heard him breathing. Was I still dreaming? Then the grip tightened, not painfully, but like whoever it was didn't want me to move. Like they were testing how solid I was. I couldn't even make a sound. My chest locked up. I didn't scream. I just stood there with one foot still in the air, balanced awkwardly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure the whole house could hear it. Then I heard something behind me. The bed springs creaked softly. I turned my head slowly, scared to even breathe. My brother was sitting up in bed. His face was pale, barely visible in the dim light leaking through the open door. His eyes were wide, and he looked as confused as I felt. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then down at where my foot was. His expression shifted. He wasn't confused anymore. He was scared. I knew that look, and I knew he wasn't faking it. Then, still watching me, he reached down and rubbed his ankle, like he'd felt the same thing. I pulled my leg back fast, yanking my foot free. I stumbled backward into the dresser, knocking over a stack of comic books. The noise must have been loud because the hallway light flicked on almost immediately, and I heard our dad's footsteps coming fast. My brother climbed out of bed, wide-eyed, and we both ran into the hallway at the same time. We didn't say anything to our parents right away. They were just confused why we were both awake and spooked. We didn't know what to say. A hand grabbed my ankle from under the bed. Sounds crazy when you're trying to explain it out loud in a lit hallway with your dad rubbing sleep out of his eyes. But neither of us wanted to go back in that room. My brother just kept shaking his head. I stood there, looking past my dad into the doorway at the shadowy underside of our bed. It looked normal now, like nothing had happened, but I knew what I felt. I could still feel it now, if I let myself remember too clearly. The way the fingers curled slowly, not in a panic, not like a reflex, just controlled. My parents thought we were just having nightmares, but we insisted we didn't want to go back. So they let us sleep on the floor in their room. We lay down on some spare blankets between their bed and the wall. It wasn't comfortable, but I didn't care. I was still too shaken to close my eyes. My brother was the same. He kept rolling over, checking behind him like he expected something to crawl in after us. The next day, we checked the room. We looked under the bed. It was just boxes, old toys, a suitcase, some schoolwork. Nothing out of place. Nothing hiding. Nothing that could have reached out and grabbed me. But we both knew what we'd felt. I didn't dream it. I was awake, alert. The cold of the floor, the way the comic books hit my leg when I fell back, they were all real. My brother had felt it too. He hadn't even been near me, and somehow he'd known. That's what scared me the most. We didn't sleep in that room again for the rest of the week. My dad told us he checked the bed frame, the boards, the space under it. Nothing was wrong. No loose wires or springs or anything that could have been mistaken for a hand. My mom thought maybe we saw a mouse or something, but mice don't grab you. They don't hold on. By the next weekend, things felt back to normal. The house was still the same. The weather had turned colder, and we put thicker blankets on the bed. I started using a flashlight at night to get down the ladder. My brother and I made a deal to both climb down at the same time if either of us needed to pee. Safety in numbers. But I never forgot how that grip felt. It wasn't just cold, it was calculated. Like whoever or whatever it was had been waiting. And that's the part that stuck with me. Waiting. Years passed, and eventually we moved to a different house. We got separate rooms, our own beds. Life went on. My brother and I stopped talking about that night. Not because we didn't remember, but because it made things worse when we did. It was one of those things that lived better in silence. Now, as an adult, I've tried to rationalize it. I've told myself it could have been a muscle twitch, my imagination, the natural fear of dark corners. But I don't believe that. I know what skin on skin feels like. I know the difference between fear and instinct. That night, something was under that bed, and it grabbed me. Maybe someone had broken in and hid under the bed, though nothing was missing and no signs of forced entry were found. Maybe it was some weird psychological episode, like mass hysteria between kids. But that doesn't explain the way my brother felt it too, from his bed. He had his own story, his own reaction. We weren't looking for attention. We were just terrified. Sometimes when I'm laying in bed at night in the dark, and I feel my foot hang slightly off the edge, I pull it back in without thinking. I don't like letting anything dangle over the side anymore. I know how silly that sounds, how childish, but it's a reflex now. Something deep in my bones that tells me not to risk it. I've never had anything like that happen again. My brother hasn't either, at least not that he's told me. But we've both had trouble sleeping ever since we were kids. We both have this thing where we can't stand the idea of someone or something being under the bed. It's not a fear of monsters. It's not about ghosts or demons. It's about the unknown. The possibility that one night, when everything is still and your mind is calm, something real, something silent and waiting, might reach out for you. That's why we slept in our parents' room for the rest of that week. Not because we were scared of a story or a nightmare, but because we both knew something touched us, something we couldn't explain, and neither of us wanted to sleep in a room where that kind of thing could happen. To this day, I still don't like bunk beds. I don't trust them. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe I'll never have a real explanation. But that doesn't change the memory. It doesn't change the fact that someone reached out in the dark. And even now, years later, when I think about it too much, I get the same chill down my spine. We never figured out what it was, but we never forgot it. Late one night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, the only light in the room coming from the small screen. It was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner running in the background. The apartment was warm but comfortable. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the city. A car honking, footsteps on the pavement, the occasional shout far away. Nothing out of the ordinary for a late hour in a busy neighborhood. I wasn't expecting any calls. I rarely get phone calls at night, especially not on my personal number. I mostly use text or social media to talk to people. Suddenly, my phone buzzed and lit up on the nightstand. The screen showed my own phone number calling me. I blinked and stared at it, confused. How could that be? It looked like a glitch, maybe some weird bug in the phone system, or some prank by a friend who had hacked my number somehow. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I swiped to answer. The call connected, and all I could hear was a faint, shaky whisper. "Don't go near the window." The voice was so low, I had to strain to hear it. It was almost like someone was scared, or maybe warning me. But before I could say anything or ask who it was, the line went dead. The screen went black, and the call ended. I sat there, heart starting to beat faster. I told myself it was probably just some technical glitch, maybe a robot call or some weird spam, though the voice sounded so clear and human. Still, I laughed nervously and put the phone down, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. Then, just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard it, a loud, hard knock right on the glass behind me. I froze. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no way someone could be knocking on my window from the outside. The building is an older brick apartment complex, and my window is about 15 feet off the ground, facing a narrow alley between 2 buildings. The alley is dark and empty at night, with no fire escapes or balconies on the side of my apartment. It would be impossible for anyone to stand or climb up there without a ladder, and there are no ladders visible from my window. The knock came again, 3 sharp, loud bangs like someone pounding with a fist. I slowly turned my head to look. The streetlight outside barely lit the alley, but I could just make out the outline of a shadow moving quickly away from the window, disappearing behind the corner of the next building. It wasn't a person standing there anymore. Whoever it was had left. My heart was pounding hard in my chest. I wanted to move, to run, but I was frozen in place. I stood up slowly, trying to listen for any other sounds, but the building was silent again. The air felt heavier, colder than before. My skin prickled. I walked over to the window, keeping my back to the alley as much as possible, and looked out. The alley was empty. No sign of anyone or anything. The trash bins were pushed against the wall, a few empty cardboard boxes stacked near the dumpsters. Nothing unusual. I shut the window tightly and locked it. Then I checked every other window in the apartment. All locked, all secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been watching me. I called the police and told them what happened. The weird call from my own number, the voice warning me not to go near the window, and then knocking on the glass. They asked me if anyone might want to hurt me or if I had any enemies. I told them no. They said they would send a patrol car to check the area and told me to stay inside and be safe. While waiting, I sat in the middle of the living room with the lights on, the curtains drawn tight. I kept my phone close and checked the locks again and again. The sound of the city outside seemed louder now, like it was filling the empty spaces with noise to hide something. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. When the police finally arrived, they walked around the building, checked the alley, looked for any signs of footprints or ladder marks. They said there was no sign of anyone climbing up or hanging around. The alley was clear, but they promised to keep an eye on the area and drive by my building during the night. I thanked them and told them I'd call if anything else happened. For days after, I felt uneasy every time I looked at that window. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice on the phone, the strange knock, and the shadow running away. I started checking the locks more often, and I bought a cheap security camera to set up near the window. It was a small device, easy to hide, and it sent footage directly to my phone. One night, about a week later, I heard something outside again, soft footsteps in the alley, slow and careful. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app. On the screen, I saw a figure crouching near the base of the building, just out of the camera's direct view. The person was wearing dark clothes, a hoodie pulled up, their face hidden. They moved quickly, checking the locks on the fire door at the back of the building. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The person pulled out a small crowbar and tried to pry the door open. The metal creaked but didn't give way. After a few seconds, they gave up and slipped away into the shadows. I called the police again and stayed on the line until they arrived. This time, they found footprints and the marks on the door. They told me the person was likely trying to break in, but gave up when they couldn't get inside quickly. After that, I made sure to never leave my apartment door unlocked, even when I was home. I bought extra locks and reinforced the window locks too. One night, I almost forgot to close the curtains before going to bed. Just as I turned to shut them, I caught a movement in the corner of my eye. Something or someone standing on the fire escape outside my window. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The person vanished before the police arrived, but they found fresh footprints on the fire escape stairs. After weeks of this, I finally moved out. I found a new place on the 5th floor of a building with better security and no alleyways nearby. I changed my phone number and blocked all unknown calls. I haven't had a single strange call or knock since. I still don't know who called me that night or why they warned me not to go near the window. But I'm sure now that it was real. Someone watching, someone dangerous. I don't answer unknown calls anymore. And I never go near windows when I'm alone at night. I had just finished dinner and was about to get ready for bed. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak from the wooden floor settling. The bathroom was right down the hall from my bedroom, a small space with a single mirror above the sink, fluorescent lights flickering softly above. I walked in, grabbed my toothbrush, squeezed a little toothpaste on, and turned on the tap. The cold water splashed into the sink. I started brushing my teeth like I always do, slow, careful strokes, looking down at the white porcelain sink. The mirror fogged slightly from the steam that had collected from the hot water earlier in the evening. As I leaned forward a little to get a better look at my teeth, I noticed movement behind me in the mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, maybe from the bathroom door swinging slightly on its hinges or something outside the window. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. Not just any figure. A man. He was standing right behind me. I could see his outline clearly in the mirror's reflection. His skin was an odd gray tone, like ash or stone. His head was smooth, but what was most unsettling was that he had no eyes. Not even eye sockets, just a flat, empty space where eyes should be. His face was blank and motionless, with no expression to read. My heart froze. My hand stopped moving. The toothbrush hung loosely between my fingers. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. For a split second, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of shadows or light reflecting oddly. So I slowly turned around, expecting to see nothing. And there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the door to my bedroom closed, and the house was silent. No one there. I blinked, trying to calm myself. I looked back up at the mirror, and my breath fogged the glass. I wiped it away with the back of my hand. And then I saw it. Written in the fog on the mirror were the words, "I see you too." The letters were clear, almost like someone had written them with their finger just moments before. But I had been alone in the house for hours. Nobody else was here. Nobody had come into the bathroom. I stared at the message, unable to look away. My heart pounded so loud, I thought it might burst through my chest. The bathroom suddenly felt cold, even though the rest of the house was warm. I wanted to turn on the lights brighter, but the harsh fluorescent bulbs above the mirror flickered and buzzed, casting long, strange shadows on the walls. I forced myself to finish brushing my teeth, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the toothbrush. I rinsed, splashing water on my face to try to clear my mind, but I couldn't stop looking at the mirror. The message was still there, slowly fading as the fog cleared. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my bedroom chair, staring out the window into the dark. Every creak of the house made me jump. I checked every lock on the doors twice. My phone sat on the nightstand, but I was too scared to call anyone. I kept imagining that man's face, the gray skin, the empty space where his eyes should be. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare or my mind playing tricks on me from stress and tiredness. I avoided looking at the bathroom mirror for as long as I could. When I had to brush my teeth or wash my face, I did it quickly with my back turned to the mirror or a towel covering it. But the feeling never left me. Every time I passed that bathroom door, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I felt watched, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. At night, I checked over my shoulder several times before falling asleep, convinced I saw shapes or shadows move just beyond the edge of the light. One night, I stayed up later than usual, trying to read or watch something on my phone to distract myself. The house was silent. I felt safer, calmer, almost like I was winning against whatever fear had settled over me. Then, without warning, the bathroom light flickered on. It wasn't the overhead bulbs. The main bathroom lights were off. This was a pale, weak glow coming from inside the room. I knew I hadn't turned it on. I froze. The light pulsed once, twice, and then went out. But just before it died, I caught a glimpse of the mirror from the doorway. The fog was back, thick and heavy this time, and the same message was written again, clearer than before. I see you too. This time, the writing didn't fade. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt like I was glued to the floor. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone had broken in and was playing a sick joke, but the doors were locked, windows shut tight, and I hadn't heard a sound. For hours after, I sat awake in the living room, lights on, windows locked, and phone in hand, waiting for morning. Days passed. The message kept appearing on the mirror. Sometimes it would show up after a shower, other times after brushing my teeth or washing my face. No matter what I did, the words were always there, waiting. And then, one night, I finally saw him again. I was brushing my teeth, just like before, staring at the mirror with dread. The fog started to gather slowly. Then I saw him behind me, the man with gray skin and no eyes. His form was clearer than ever. Standing close enough, I could see the details of his smooth, lifeless face. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing. But when I looked back, the mirror was clear, no fog, no message, no man. I felt relief flood through me for a moment. Then I noticed something else. On the bathroom floor, just behind me, was a small pile of gray ash. I stared down, heart pounding, confused and terrified. I bent closer and touched it lightly. It crumbled in my fingers like dried dust. I couldn't explain it. The house was clean, no candles or fireplaces in the bathroom. No smoke, no fire had ever been there. After that night, I stopped using that bathroom. I moved my toothbrush and toiletries to the kitchen sink, brushing my teeth there even though it was awkward. I called a handyman to replace the bathroom mirror, thinking maybe the glass was damaged or had something strange about it. He took out the old mirror and installed a new one. No more fog appeared, no messages, no figures. But I never felt completely safe there again. Every time I passed the bathroom, I could still feel that cold weight, like something unseen was watching me, waiting. I told a few close friends what happened. They thought I was stressed or imagining things. I didn't blame them. I wasn't sure what to believe myself. Months later, I moved out of that apartment. I didn't look back. Even now, when I brush my teeth or look in a mirror, a part of me wonders if that gray-skinned man is still there somewhere, watching. And I know, no matter where I go, I will always carry that feeling with me. The feeling that someone can see me, even when I can't see them. I was dog sitting at my friend's house out in the country, a place that always felt a little too quiet. The house stood alone on a stretch of dirt road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the stars. I had stayed there a few times before, usually during the day, but this was my first night alone with the dog, a big, calm golden retriever named Max. He was friendly and well-behaved, but I still felt a little uneasy being out there by myself. The house was old but solid. It had creaky wooden floors, thick walls, and the kind of windows that rattled just a little when the wind blew. The front door was made of heavy wood, with a small peephole at eye level. The porch light was old-fashioned, casting a soft yellow glow across the porch steps. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine cleaner and something else, maybe the dog, maybe the old wood. I spent the evening watching TV in the living room with Max lying at my feet. I didn't hear any cars drive by on the road, no sound from the neighbors. It was just me, the dog, and the quiet night outside. At some point, I checked my phone. No signal out here, so I turned it off and put it on the kitchen counter. Around midnight, I was just about to get ready for bed when I heard it. 4 soft knocks on the front door. Not loud, not urgent, just 4 light taps. I froze. The house was supposed to be empty, and no one knew I was here alone. I didn't expect anyone to come by this late, especially not out here where there wasn't even a street light. I quietly got up and walked to the door. My heart was beating faster than normal. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see someone standing right there. Maybe a neighbor or a lost traveler. But I saw nothing. The porch was empty. No car, no figure, Nothing but the shadow of the trees against the porch light. Confused, I stepped back. That's when I noticed something strange. The knocks didn't come from the part of the door with the peephole. The knocking was too high up, above where the door frame ended. The knocks sounded like they came from above the door, maybe from the wooden beam or even the wall next to it. I looked up carefully in the dim light. There was no doorbell, no window, just the dark wood and the porch roof overhead. My mind raced. How could someone knock there? It didn't make sense. Maybe the wind had caused something to tap against the door, but the pattern was too regular for that. For clear knocks, spaced evenly like someone was trying to get my attention. I walked away from the door, feeling a growing chill in the air. I glanced outside again through the window next to the door. The yard was empty and silent. No footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. No car lights in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I grabbed Max's leash from the hook by the door and took him with me as I locked all the doors and windows again, triple checking the deadbolt. I moved slowly through the house, turning on every light, making sure every window was shut tight. Max stayed close to me, his ears twitching every time a branch scraped against the house or a bird called somewhere in the dark. I decided to take refuge in the bathroom. It was the smallest room with no windows to the outside, just a solid wooden door and white tiles that made it feel cold but safe. I locked the door behind me, grabbed Max's leash, and sat on the floor next to the toilet. Max lay down beside me, resting his head on my knee. The silence inside the bathroom was heavy, almost thick enough to touch. I stayed there for hours. Every time I heard a small sound outside, a twig snapping, the wind sighing through the trees, I jumped a little. I didn't turn on the TV again or check my phone. I didn't want to draw attention to myself if anyone was lurking nearby. At one point, I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Not loud, but slow and careful. The crunch of the gravel under boots. I held my breath, pressed my back against the cool wall, and squeezed Max's fur with my hand. The steps stopped just outside the front porch, then slowly moved away, fading into the night. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. I thought about calling the police, but I had no signal and didn't want to leave the bathroom. I stayed put, hoping the night would pass quickly. When the first light of dawn peeked through the bathroom vent, I felt exhausted but safe. The knocking never came again, and the footsteps never returned. I opened the bathroom door slowly, letting Max slip out first. I crept to the front door and looked outside. The yard was empty, the gravel driveway clear. No sign of anyone. No footprints or tire tracks. I realized then that whoever or whatever had been out there had left long ago, probably scared off by the locked doors and the brightening day. I didn't tell my friend about the knocking. I didn't want to worry them or sound crazy. But after that night, I never stayed alone at that house again. I always felt something watching from the trees, something just out of reach, real enough to make the night feel long, but never close enough to explain. Back in high school, I lived on the edge of a small town surrounded by farmland. There wasn't much to do out there, just long stretches of road, old barns, and fields that went on forever. It was quiet, which I liked most of the time. I was never much of a team sports guy, but I liked staying in shape, so I jogged. Every day after school, I'd throw on my shoes, cut through the backyard, and hit a narrow dirt trail that sliced through a big cornfield about a half-mile from my house. It wasn't technically a public trail, but nobody cared. The farmer was an older guy named Mr. Harrow, and he was the kind of person who waved without smiling. He didn't mind me using it as long as I didn't mess with anything. The trail was peaceful. During the summer and into early fall, the corn would grow tall, and the path would turn into this green tunnel. The ground was dry and firm, and the only sound were the wind moving through the stalks, my footsteps, and my breathing. I liked to run close to sunset because the air cooled down and the sky always lit up with orange and pink streaks behind the corn. That day started like any other. It was late September, one of those evenings where the sun dips lower and everything starts to feel slower. The air had that dry, crackly smell of changing seasons. I remember leaving the house around 6:30, figuring I had maybe 45 minutes before it got too dark. I jogged past the edge of the woods behind our neighborhood, hopped the fence, and made my way toward the cornfield. The sky was glowing orange and the shadows were getting long, but I'd done this run plenty of times in the same light. I wasn't worried. About 10 minutes in, I hit the trail that ran through the middle of the corn. The stalks towered above me, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. The rows were dense, like green walls on both sides, and if you weren't on the path, you'd get lost in minutes. The field always gave off this steady rustling sound, even without wind. I used to think it was just the stalks shifting in the breeze, but sometimes it felt like something moving just out of sight. I'd brush it off as deer or raccoons. It's the country, after all. I kept a steady pace, feet pounding rhythmically on the dirt. I had my headphones in, some old busted pair I used for jogging, blasting something fast enough to keep me motivated. About halfway through the run, I noticed something weird. The usual noise of the cornfield, that low whisper of leaves brushing together, had quieted. It was too still. I pulled one earbud out, slowing a bit, and looked around. The trail was empty in both directions. The sun had dropped lower, turning the field a dull gold, and the shadows were deepening. That's when I saw it. Off to the right, maybe 20 feet into the corn, there was a figure standing perfectly still between the rows. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow, a really tall one. It looked like a person wearing baggy clothes, arms slack at their sides, just standing there. The head was kind of slumped forward, like it was looking at the ground. I stopped jogging completely and squinted, trying to get a better look. My first instinct was that Mr. Harrow had set up a new scarecrow, maybe something more lifelike to scare off the deer. But something about it felt wrong. It was too tall, way too tall. It had to be over 7 feet, and the shoulders were way too broad. Its arms looked longer than they should have been, like they hung too low. The whole shape was off, too lean in some places and too thick in others. I stood there, watching it, not moving, barely breathing. Then it moved. Not much, just the head. It turned, slowly. It lifted slightly and turned to face me. I felt the air leave my chest. It wasn't like turning your head to look around. It was stiff, deliberate, like it was rotating its whole upper body just to bring its face in line with me. I couldn't see the eyes or any real detail, just the shift in angle and the way its posture changed. I knew, in that moment, it was watching me. Not just noticing me, but watching me, focused on me like a cat watches something in the grass. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't care how fast or how long. I just ran as hard as I could back down the trail, lungs burning, chest tight. My footsteps kicked up dry dirt. I ripped the other earbud out so I could hear everything, every crackle, every shift behind me. I swore I heard something moving in the corn beside me, like footsteps mirroring mine on the other side of the rows. I didn't look. I couldn't look. I just ran. I burst out of the cornfield, heart slamming in my chest, and didn't stop until I made it back to the fence behind my house. I scaled it, legs shaking, and ran through the backyard to the porch. I sat on the steps, gasping, trying to understand what I'd seen. My hands were trembling, and I had that cold sweat that sticks to your skin even in the cool evening air. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about that thing, how it stood, how it turned to look at me. I didn't tell anyone at first. What was I going to say? I saw a really tall guy in the corn and got scared. Even if someone believed me, there wasn't much they could do. The next day, after school, I walked out to the field again. Not to run, just to look. It was still. The trail was empty, just like always. I followed it slowly, every step feeling heavier, until I reached the spot where I thought I'd seen the figure. The corn there looked disturbed, like something had moved through it, flattening the stalks. I stepped into the rows carefully, trying not to think about what might be on the other side. I didn't find anything, but the feeling stayed. That same wrongness. The sense that I was being watched. I didn't stick around long. Later that week, I saw Mr. Harrow while riding my bike down the road near his property. I stopped and tried to make it sound casual. I asked him if he had put up any new scarecrows lately. He just looked at me, kind of squinting under the brim of his cap. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You saw him too, huh?" That's all he said at first. Then he nodded toward a big oak tree at the edge of the field. The bark was worn, rough and gray. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. He walked over, slow, and pointed at a spot on the trunk. There were long, deep scratch marks like gouges made by something with claws or nails. They started about chest height and reached up to well over 6 feet. No animal around here does that. No bear, no cougar, nothing that high. And the lines were too straight, too wide apart, like they came from fingers instead of paws. Mr. Harrow didn't explain. He didn't have to. That's all he said. And then he walked off like it was something he'd already come to terms with. Like this wasn't new to him. I stopped running the trail after that. I took the long way around town, stuck to the roads. People asked me why, and I said I was tired of the dirt path or that it was too muddy. I never told them the real reason. I don't think they would have understood, but I kept thinking about that figure. How tall it was, how quiet, how it turned its head with such strange control, like it wasn't quite right. I wondered if anyone else had seen it, if maybe it had been there longer than any of us knew. Maybe it only showed itself to certain people. Maybe it liked the cornfield because it could move without being seen, watching from between the rows. Over the next few weeks, I heard stories. Not direct ones, but little things. Someone's dog went missing near the field. Another neighbor said their son came home crying, saying he saw a tall man watching him while he walked home from school. Nobody connected the dots, though. They just chalked it up to wild animals or imagination. I started watching the tree. Every few days, I'd ride by and look at the scratch marks. They didn't fade. In fact, they looked newer some days. Deeper, like whatever made them came back. I once thought I saw a new set even higher up the trunk, but I didn't stop to check. Winter came, and the cornfield was cut down. The trail looked completely different, open, exposed. But I didn't go back, not even when it snowed and the ground looked calm and clean. I didn't trust that it was gone. Years later, I moved away for college, then work. I came back to visit family every now and then. The field's still there. Different crop rotation now. Sometimes soybeans, sometimes just grass. But every time I pass by, I glance at that oak tree. The marks are still there. Weathered now, faded a bit, but still visible. Still tall. Sometimes I think about that night when I'm running alone in a different part of the country. Whenever I hear something in the trees or catch a shape in my peripheral vision, I feel my chest tighten. I can't shake the image, the unnatural height, the long arms, the way it turned its head. Not quickly, not like a person. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some fairy tale monster. It was real, something that walked on 2 legs, that could stand still enough to blend into a cornfield and quiet enough to vanish without a sound. And I know I'm not the only one who's seen it. I don't tell the story often. When I do, I leave parts out. People want ghosts or demons, something with rules and reasons. This wasn't that. This was something else. Something that doesn't need a reason. Something that's just out there, watching. When I was 12, we lived in an older 2-story house on the edge of town. The kind with creaky floorboards and thin windows that made everything outside sound louder than it should be. It had chipped paint on the walls, old radiator heaters that barely worked in the winter, and the kind of plumbing that rattled every time you turn on the tap. My dad bought it cheap because it needed a lot of work and we were trying to make do. He was fixing it up bit by bit while still working full-time, so some things like the pipes had to wait. We weren't the kind of family that complained much. My mom left when I was little, so it was just my dad, my older brother Jake, and me. We all had our routines. Jake and I shared a room on the 2nd floor. Dad slept down the hall. The bathroom was right in the middle. It had an old sink with rust stains around the drain, one of those pedestal sinks that looks like it belongs in a museum. The pipes underneath were exposed and made of thick metal, some of them wrapped in cracked insulation. It was ugly, but it worked. Mostly. One night in early spring, I woke up needing to pee. It must have been just past midnight. The house was quiet except for the usual ticking from the radiators. I slipped out of bed and padded into the bathroom in my socks. The hallway light was off, but I didn't need it. I'd walked that route hundreds of times in the dark. I went in, shut the door behind me, and flipped on the light. The bulb buzzed a bit before lighting up fully. I did my business, flushed, and went to wash my hands. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, like the sound of a whisper underwater. I leaned forward to the sink, ready to turn the tap when I heard my name. It wasn't loud. It was low, raspy, and garbled, like someone trying to talk with their mouth full of water. It came from the drain. I stood there, frozen, not sure if I'd really heard it. Then it came again, clearer this time, but still wet and choked. My name, dragging slowly like it hurt to say. I remember leaning in closer without realizing I was doing it, like something in me needed to confirm it wasn't real. My heart started pounding in my chest. The sink looked the same as always. The rust stains, the cracked enamel around the drain, the slight drip from the faucet. But the voice came again, and this time I knew I wasn't imagining it. It was calling me. I stepped back fast, knocking into the edge of the toilet behind me. My first thought was that Jake was messing with me. He was always pulling dumb pranks, hiding behind doors, whispering weird stuff just to scare me. I figured he'd somehow figured out how to use the plumbing to mess with me. Maybe he was under the house or something. I rushed back to our room. Jake was in bed, dead asleep, snoring lightly like he always did. The kind of snore that sounds like breathing through a stuffed nose. I stood there for a minute, not knowing what to think. Then I went to wake up Dad. He wasn't happy about being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night, but he followed me to the bathroom. Of course, the voice was gone. He flipped the tap on and off, looked in the sink, even knocked on the pipe below. Nothing. He told me maybe it was a dream, or maybe I heard water draining funny. I could tell he didn't believe me, but he didn't say it out loud. Just told me to go back to bed. I lay awake for a long time that night. My bed didn't feel right. The walls didn't feel right. Everything in the house felt off. Not haunted, not like ghosts, just wrong. The air felt heavy, like something was watching from the walls, waiting. I finally drifted off around dawn. The next morning, I went back into the bathroom while brushing my teeth. That's when I saw it. A thick black clump of hair was stuck in the drain. Not just a few strands, but a full clump like someone ripped it out of their head and shoved it down the sink. It was soaked, glistening wet. The water around it had a slight tint to it, like it had been soaking in something dirty. I stood there staring at it. My stomach turned. None of us had long hair. Dad kept his shave close. Jake had short curls. I had a regular boy's cut. This was too long to be ours. I called for Dad. He came in, looked at it, and frowned. He grabbed a pair of pliers and pulled the hair out slowly. It came out in one long, knotted mass. It smelled like mildew. He didn't say anything, just dropped it into a plastic bag and threw it out with the trash. He didn't talk about it after that, and I didn't bring it up again either. But things didn't stop there. Over the next couple of weeks, the pipes started making more noise. Not the usual banging or rattling. This was different. It started as a low gurgle, like something trying to breathe. Then there were groans, soft, strained, unnatural sounds that echoed faintly through the house late at night. Mostly from the bathroom. I stopped using it after dark. I'd hold it until morning. Jake teased me about it, but I didn't care. One night, I was in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard it again. A wet whisper just outside the room. Not from the hallway, from a wall behind the bed. I didn't sleep that night. Dad called a plumber the next day. I stayed home from school, pretending to be sick so I could listen. The guy showed up with a big tool bag, took one look at the exposed pipes under the sink, and let out a whistle. He said the plumbing was ancient and probably hadn't been updated since the 1940s. He unscrewed the drain trap and let out a groan when it came loose. It was full of hair again, more than before, coiled up like it had been nesting in there. He pulled it out with a hook and laid it on a towel. It smelled foul, like moldy towels left in a basement too long. He said something about it being a buildup. Maybe someone who lived there before had long hair and it never got properly cleaned out. But I knew that wasn't right. The smell was too strong, too fresh. Dad didn't argue. He just told the guy to clean everything out. The plumber spent the next hour snaking the pipes. When he was done, he said everything should flow fine now, but that we might want to think about replacing the system eventually. It would be expensive. We didn't have that kind of money. Things were quiet for a while after that. A week, maybe. I started using the bathroom again at night, but I never looked directly at the drain. I couldn't shake the image of that clump of hair. I started to get this itch in the back of my head every time I stepped into the bathroom. Like something was watching. Like the room was waiting. Then one night, while brushing my teeth, the faucet sputtered. It didn't come on right away. Just made a choking noise, then coughed out brown water. I jumped back as it splattered the sink. It cleared up after a second, ran clean again. But that smell came back. That same moldy, rotted smell, like old hair soaked in dirty water. I didn't say anything to Dad. I could tell he was stressed enough. A few days later, Jake and I got into a fight about something stupid. I think it was about the remote or who got to use the shower first. I don't even remember. I ended up storming into the bathroom and slamming the door behind me. I sat on the toilet lid, arms crossed, just fuming. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, I noticed the sound again. The gurgling from the pipes. Then the whisper. My name. It didn't sound like a person anymore. It was more like a recording that had been warped, slowed down, damaged. Choppy and uneven. It wasn't angry. It wasn't asking for help. It just was. Like it belonged there, and I didn't. That night, I had a dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. I was in the hallway outside the bathroom. The door was open. Water was dripping from the ceiling. I walked in, and the sink was overflowing, not with water, but with hair. It was pushing up from the drain like weeds. Soaking wet, black and knotted. The faucet was hissing. Then I saw something move underneath it, like the hair was attached to something deep in the pipe. I woke up sweating. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Even the radiators had gone still. I didn't go in that bathroom for a long time after that. I started going downstairs to the old utility sink in the basement, even though the light down there barely worked. It felt safer somehow, even with all the cobwebs and dust. Dad finally had enough when the upstairs toilet stopped flushing right. The plumber came back, and this time he brought a camera scope. I watched from the hall while he fed the long wire down the drain. The tiny screen showed the inside of the pipe, dark, damp, corroded. Then he stopped. He called Dad over. They whispered. I heard the word collapse and form material. That weekend, Dad ripped out the entire bathroom sink and replaced it. He didn't hire anyone, just did it himself over 2 days. He pulled up the floorboards, replaced some of the pipe, put in a brand new sink from the hardware store. The old one sat in the garage for weeks before he finally hauled it to the dump. The sound stopped after that. No more voices. No more hair. Years later, when I was older, I asked him about it. We were sitting on the porch, drinking coffee. I brought it up casually, like I wasn't still thinking about it sometimes when I couldn't sleep. He was quiet for a while. Then he told me something I didn't know. A woman had lived in the house before us. Alone. She had gone missing years before we moved in. No foul play ever confirmed. They assumed she left town, or something happened and no one found out. Her hair, he said, was black and long, down her waist. He didn't want to tell me back then. Thought it would scare me more. Thought it was probably nothing. But he never rented that house out after we moved. Never sold it either. It just sat there, locked up, slowly falling apart. I never went back. I never planned to go out that night. The day had been ordinary. Work, dinner, some TV. But a text from a friend changed everything. She said a small group was heading out to an old hiking trail nearby, one that few people knew about and that was close enough to the city to reach in under an hour. It sounded like a chance to get out and breathe fresh air away from the noise and lights. So I agreed to meet them. The trail was supposed to be easy, mostly flat with just a few rocky patches. Nothing dangerous, they said. I'd never been to this place before, but I was familiar with hiking and had done a few overnight trips. I packed light, a flashlight, water, a small first aid kit, and a little food. We met at the parking lot just before sunset. The lot was small and surrounded by dense woods. The cars were spaced out, some with faded paint and dirt on the tires. Signs that people came here for serious outdoor time, not just a quick walk. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. The sky was clear but turning pink as the sun dipped behind the trees. We started walking as a group of 5. The others were chatting quietly about the day, but I stayed a few steps behind, watching the trail. It was narrow and lined with thick bushes. The ground was soft from recent rain. Every few steps, a twig snapped or a dry leaf rustled underfoot. The forest felt alive but calm. After about 30 minutes, the sun had set completely. We switched on our flashlights. The beam cut through the darkness, but the woods seemed endless beyond the edges of light. I noticed how the sounds changed. The birds stopped singing. The insects buzzed quietly, but there was also something else, a faint rustling deeper in the trees, just out of sight. We kept moving forward. The trail curved around a small hill. I caught sight of an old cabin off to the left, mostly hidden by vines and overgrown grass. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and the door hanging slightly open. We paused briefly to look, but no one wanted to go closer. As we pressed on, the group thinned out. Some slowed, some stopped to check their phones or tie their shoes. I stayed close to the back, making sure no one got left behind. About an hour in, the trail grew rougher. The ground was covered in loose rocks and tree roots. The forest grew thicker, and the trees seemed taller, their branches forming a nearly solid canopy overhead. The flashlight beams struggled to cut through the darkness. I felt a chill creep up my spine, not from the cold, but from an odd sense of being watched. I tried to shake it off. After all, we were 5 people together, and the forest was full of animals, not something dangerous. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack, like a branch breaking close by. I stopped and turned my head sharply, shining my light toward the noise. Nothing, just shadows and trees. A few moments later, another sound, a heavy footstep on dry leaves, just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the footsteps didn't sound like any animal I knew. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I quickened my pace, trying to catch up to the others. My legs felt tense, and my breath came faster. The trail suddenly forked. I waited for the group to choose a path, but no one said anything. I heard whispers, low voices, but they seemed to be coming from all directions, the forest itself. I picked the left path, hoping the others would follow. The trail narrowed even more, barely wide enough for one person. The trees closed in, and the air grew thick and hard to breathe. Then I heard again, footsteps, closer this time, faster. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face and arms. My flashlight swung wildly, casting erratic shadows. I could hear something crashing through the bushes behind me. I pushed harder, stumbling over roots and rocks. The forest felt like it was closing in. I tripped and fell, scraping my hands and knees on a rough ground. Pain flared, but I forced myself up. Ahead, I saw a faint glow, an opening, maybe a clearing. I burst into the clearing and stopped, gasping for air. The moon was full and bright here, spilling light onto the grass. The sound behind me stopped. I looked around, heart pounding. The forest was silent again. Then I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not animal prints, human, large and heavy. They were fresh and led from the edge of the trees to the clearing. I followed the prints to the other side, where a dirt road appeared. Relief flooded me. If I could just get to that road, I could find help. As I reached the road, I saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming. I waved my arms, hoping the driver would see me. The car slowed and stopped beside me. I got in without a word and told the driver to take me home. Once safe inside my apartment, I tried to calm down. I called the others, but no one answered. I texted, but no replies. The next morning, I went back to the trail with a friend and the police. We searched, but there was no sign of the group or anyone else. The abandoned cabin was gone, as if it had never been there. The footprints I had seen were gone too. I never went back to that trail. I stopped hiking at night, and I still get chills thinking about the footsteps that followed me in the dark woods. I had been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway to clear my head, a break from the noise of work and the endless demands of daily life. I found the Airbnb through a last-minute deal online. The place looked perfect in the pictures, an old but charming house set back in the woods, far enough from the town to promise peace and quiet. The host profile was solid, with good reviews. No red flags. I didn't think twice about booking it. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The GPS led me down narrow country roads, surrounded by dense forest. The trees leaned over the road like they were watching, branches scraping the sides of my car. When I finally reached the driveway, the house was just as the pictures showed, wooden siding, paint peeling in places, but still solid looking. It sat on a small hill with a gravel driveway, the kind of place you expect to see in a mystery novel. The sun was setting behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the porch. I parked and took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. I told myself it was just the quiet and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I grabbed my bags and walked up to the front door. The lock clicked open smoothly. The host had sent me a keypad code in advance. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, damp wood mixed with an earthy, almost musty scent. It wasn't unpleasant, just the smell of an old house that hadn't been lived in for a while. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I moved through the entryway. The house was small, maybe 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. The furniture was sparse but clean, with a worn leather couch and a small dining table with mismatched chairs. A few books and magazines sat on a shelf, but nothing too personal. I liked the simplicity. I unpacked my things quickly and started exploring. The kitchen was basic but functional. There was a stove, a fridge, and a small counter. I found some canned goods and coffee packets left by the host, along with a note saying, "Welcome. Hope you enjoy your stay." It felt welcoming, but the silence in the house was heavy. I flicked on some lights. The bulbs were dim but worked. Outside, I could hear the forest settling for the night, distant birds calling and the occasional rustle of small animals. No cars, no people, just the woods. I sat down on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky darken. The stars started to come out in clusters, bright and cold. Later, I made myself some dinner and ate at the table by the window. The kitchen light was the only thing on, and shadows from the tree branches moved across the walls like slow fingers. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the quiet and the dark messing with my senses. After dinner, I settled on the couch with a book. The wind had picked up outside, pushing branches against the windows with a sharp tapping noise. The house was creaking and settling, and every little sound made me jump. I tried to focus on the book, but the silence around me felt unnatural, almost like the house was holding its breath. When I finally decided to go to bed, I noticed the bedroom was colder than the rest of the house. The windows were old, and despite the curtains, I could see faint shapes moving outside in the shadows. I locked the door, pulled the blanket tight, and tried to sleep. But the house didn't let me rest. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. It was faint at first, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across wood. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart started pounding, and I reminded myself there was no one else here. It was an old house, maybe a branch hitting the window or the floorboards shifting. I got up slowly and opened the door, just a crack. The hallway was empty and dark. I couldn't see anything, but the scraping sound had stopped. I scanned the floor with my flashlight, checking for anything out of place. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it again, telling myself to calm down. I sat on the bed for a while, but then another noise came, this time from downstairs. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, moving across the wooden floor. I swallowed hard, trying not to panic. I told myself the host might have come in to check something and forgotten to leave a note. But it was almost 1 in the morning. Who would do that? I grabbed my phone and checked the Airbnb messages. Nothing new. I considered calling the host, but hesitated. Maybe it was just an animal getting inside the house somehow. But how would it get upstairs? I decided to investigate. I crept out of the bedroom, flashlight in hand, and carefully went down the stairs. Each step groaned loudly, echoing through the silent house. The hallway at the bottom was dark and still. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was slightly ajar. I felt a cold rush of fear. I had locked that door when I arrived. I stepped closer and pushed it shut. It wasn't locked. I found the bolt and slid into place. No sign of forced entry or anything out of place inside the house. The windows were closed tight. I stood there for a few minutes, breathing hard, listening for any more noises. There was nothing but the wind outside and the distant calls of animals. I told myself to call the police if anything else happened. I wasn't going to stay in a place where someone might have broken in. I went back upstairs and checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains. The house felt different in the light, less threatening. I brewed some coffee and decided to leave early. I packed quickly, feeling eager to get back to civilization. As I was loading my bags into the car, I noticed something strange on the porch steps. A small pile of dry leaves and dirt, like someone had been dragging something there. I brushed it away, but underneath was a shallow scratch mark on the wood. It looked like something had been scraping the porch. I checked my phone again and found a new message from the host, sent early that morning. Sorry for any noises last night. The house is old, and the woods around here are full of deer and raccoons. They sometimes come close and make noise. Hope you're having a good stay. I didn't reply. I got into my car and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror at the house fading behind me. I didn't feel scared anymore, just glad to be leaving. Later, when I got home and looked back over the pictures I'd taken, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint set of footprints leading from the porch into the woods. Too small to be an adult's, and the scratch marks on the porch were deeper than I thought. Maybe it was an animal, maybe not. But whatever it was, I knew I wouldn't go back there again. I learned something important that weekend. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the real, quiet moments where you realize how alone you really are and how little you can control in a place you thought was safe. The woods don't care about you. The old houses don't care either. They just exist, holding their secrets, waiting for someone to notice. And that's enough to unsettle anyone. The weekend was supposed to be a break from everything. Just me and my girlfriend, Sarah, tucked away in a small cabin in the woods. We found the place online, an Airbnb listing that looked perfect. It was far from town, with no neighbors in sight. The picture showed a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, a porch with a few rocking chairs, and a fireplace inside. The listing promised peace and quiet, and that's exactly what we wanted after months of nonstop work and city noise. We packed up Friday morning, leaving early to avoid traffic. The drive was long but calming, the road winding through dense forests and hills. When we pulled up, the cabin looked even better in person. It stood alone on a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. We unloaded the car slowly, taking in the fresh air and the quiet that seemed to wrap around the place like a blanket. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small living area with a couch and a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with the basics, and a bedroom with a queen-size bed. The windows all had thick curtains, and there were heavy wooden doors that locked firmly. The owner had left a note welcoming us and giving instructions on how to use the security cameras outside and inside the cabin. The cameras weren't obvious at first glance. Small black boxes hidden near the ceiling in the living room and by the front door. That first night was perfect. We made a fire in the stove, cooked some dinner, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the stars come out. No other lights anywhere. No sounds except the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, exactly what we needed. The next day, we explored the nearby trails and found a small creek a few minutes from the cabin. We took our time, enjoying the quiet, the sound of water running over rocks, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles. We came back tired and happy, planning to spend the evening watching movies and maybe having another fire. That night is when things started to feel off. We went to bed early, both exhausted from the hike. The cabin felt cold, but the heater was working fine. Around midnight, I was almost asleep when I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Sarah shifting in bed or maybe an animal outside. But the footsteps were slow and deliberate, walking softly across the wooden floor. They stopped near the bedroom door. I froze. The door was locked, and I checked it without opening. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside with us. Sarah didn't wake up. I didn't want to disturb her and thought maybe I imagined it. After a few minutes, the sound started again, quieter this time, like someone was moving carefully around the living room. My heart was pounding, but I didn't know what to do. I wanted to check the cameras, but it was the middle of the night, and the cabin had no Wi-Fi except for a weak cell signal outside. We couldn't see the footage from our phones. I lay awake the rest of the night, barely sleeping, listening for any noise. The footsteps never came near the bedroom again, but I kept hearing soft movements, like someone shifting or breathing in the the next room. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling or animals outside, but I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I called the owner. I explained what happened, trying not to sound too panicked. He seemed calm but said the cabin was in a remote area, and sometimes animals or even deer caused noises. He said the doors and windows were all secure and locked, and no one could have gotten in. Still, I wasn't convinced. We spent the day outside, but I kept thinking about those footsteps. When we got back that evening, I decided to check the security cameras myself. The owner had left the password on a note, so I connected the tablet to the cabin's Wi-Fi and opened the app. The footage was chilling. Around 3 p.m., when we were out hiking, a man appeared at the front door. He looked around nervously, then used a slim tool to pick the lock. The door clicked open, and he slipped inside quickly, shutting the door softly behind him. The cameras showed him walking slowly through the cabin. He opened drawers and looked around, but didn't take anything. Instead, he moved toward a closet near the bedroom. The man opened the closet door, disappeared inside, and closed it behind him. The footage jumped to later that night, around midnight, the exact time I heard the footsteps. The man quietly stepped out of the closet and moved around the cabin, staying just out of the bedroom. He seemed cautious, almost scared himself. After a few minutes, he returned to the closet and stayed there until dawn. I replayed the video several times, feeling a mix of fear and anger. We had been sleeping with an intruder hiding just a few feet away. I called the owner back immediately, demanding to know why he hadn't told us about this. His tone changed. After a long pause, he admitted that the cabin had been broken into before, months earlier. Someone had gotten in the same way, but nothing was stolen and no one was hurt. He apologized for not telling us, saying he didn't want to scare guests away or ruin their experience. I told him we were leaving immediately. We packed up our things in silence, the air heavy with tension. As we locked the cabin for the last time, I double-checked every door and window. On the drive back, neither of us said much. The woods that had seemed so peaceful now felt like a trap. When we got home, I reported the break-in to the local police and the Airbnb platform. They told me they would investigate, but these kinds of things in remote areas were hard to prevent. Looking back, the worst part wasn't the break-in itself. It was knowing someone had been inside the same space as us, hidden and watching while we thought we were safe. The owner's silence felt like a betrayal. We trusted that place to give us peace, but it almost cost us everything. Since then, I've been more careful about where I stay. I check reviews for any hint of trouble, ask questions about security, and never ignore my gut feeling. The woods might be quiet, but sometimes the danger is closer than you think, hiding just behind a locked door. I booked the cottage on a quiet stretch of countryside that promised a break from city noise. The listing called it a family-friendly, cozy retreat, perfect for a weekend getaway. The picture showed a charming little house with whitewashed walls, a porch with a swing, and flower beds bursting with color. I was tired of the usual hotels and wanted something peaceful, somewhere I could just relax, maybe catch up on reading, and take long walks. The price was reasonable, and the host seemed nice enough in the messages. I figured it was just what I needed. When I arrived, the place was exactly as advertised, quaint and tidy, with the smell of fresh paint mixed with old wood. The garden was neat, and a few birds chirped nearby. I parked my car beside the cottage and stepped inside. The floors creaked gently underfoot, and the sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the walls. It felt warm and inviting, like a place someone had lovingly cared for. But as soon as I stepped in, my eyes caught sight of a doll sitting in the corner of the living room. It was old-fashioned, one of those porcelain-faced dolls with painted eyes and curled hair tied with faded ribbons. It wore a lace dress, yellowed with age, and its face was fixed in a faint, neutral smile. At first, I thought it was just a decorative piece, the kind of thing someone might leave behind to add charm or maybe a little nostalgia to the room. I didn't pay it much mind and moved on to explore the rest of the cottage. The kitchen was small but well equipped, with a kettle, a toaster, and a few mismatched dishes stacked neatly in the cabinets. The bedroom had a soft, old quilt on the bed, and the windows opened wide to let in the fresh air. I unpacked my bag and settled in, feeling pleased with the cozy atmosphere. That first night, after a long drive, I was ready to sleep early. I turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and crawled under the quilt. But as I lay there in the dark, I started hearing sounds that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, like tiny footsteps, almost like someone was walking softly across the floorboards. Then, there was a quiet giggling just out of reach. It wasn't loud enough to be real, or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. I sat up and listened closely, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I flicked on the bedside lamp and looked around. Nothing moved, and the room was empty except for me. I shrugged and told myself it was probably the house settling or the wind outside. Old houses make noises at night. I tried to go back to sleep, but the giggling started again, just as soft as before, and the footsteps seemed closer this time, like they were pacing near the living room. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just tired from the trip. I got up early and made some coffee, sitting at the kitchen table and looking around. That doll was still there, in the same spot as before. But when I glanced away for a moment and looked back, it had moved. It wasn't sitting in the corner anymore. It was now on the low shelf by the fireplace. I blinked hard and looked again. Maybe I was seeing things I thought. I moved over and put the doll back in the corner, shaking my head. I spent the day walking around the small village nearby, talking to a few locals and enjoying the quiet. The cottage felt safe in the daylight, but when I returned, the doll had moved again. This time it was sitting upright on the armrest of the couch, staring right at me. My skin prickled. I moved it back and made sure to put it out of sight behind a stack of books. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps were louder and more frequent, circling the room. The giggling was sharper, and sometimes it felt like there were whispers just beyond hearing. I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the doll spot every few minutes. Each time, it had moved somewhere new, on the windowsill, near the kitchen table, even once on the bathroom sink. I stopped trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. It was too consistent to be coincidence. The doll was moving on its own. I locked the doors and windows, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to stay calm. I told myself no one was here with me. No one had entered the house, and the doll wasn't alive. Still, the sound of those footsteps and the giggling kept me on edge until dawn. The next day, I messaged the host through the app. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I kept it simple. Is there any history to the doll in the living room? I've noticed it moves, and I've been hearing noises at night. The reply came much later, just a short message. The host said the doll belonged to a child who had lived in the house years ago. The child's family moved away suddenly, and locals said the doll was haunted or cursed. The host himself didn't believe it, but he thought it was best to let guests know, just in case. I didn't respond. The word haunted sent a chill through me. I wasn't a superstitious person, but I also didn't want to stay and find out more. I packed my things quickly, trying to ignore the unease twisting in my stomach. Before leaving, I took one last look around the living room. The doll was back in its original corner, sitting perfectly still, but I wasn't fooled. I felt like it had been watching me the whole time. I didn't wait to say goodbye to the host or ask questions. I locked the door behind me, jumped in my car, and drove away as fast as I could, the uneasy feeling growing heavier with every mile. After I got home, I tried to shake off the experience. I told a few friends about it, expecting them to laugh or dismiss it. Some thought it was funny, others said old houses had creaky noises, and the doll moving was probably just me misplacing it. But I knew what I had seen and heard. The doll wasn't just decoration, and the noises weren't just the house settling. A few weeks later, I checked the reviews online for that cottage. Several guests mentioned the doll and strange noises. Some laughed it off, others said they left early, just like me. The host had posted a short note warning people about the doll, but said it was part of the house's charm. I never went back, and I never stayed in a place with an old doll sitting alone in the corner again. It wasn't about ghosts or spooky stories. It was about feeling watched, unsettled, and unsafe in a place that was supposed to be peaceful. The cottage was cozy all right, but that doll and the sounds at night made it something else entirely. something I wasn't willing to face twice. The weekend started out like any other. A group of friends and I had booked a beach house for a couple of days, just to get away from the city noise and work stress. It was a small group, 5 of us in total, me and my 2 closest friends from college, and 2 others I'd known through work. We'd all been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The house was right on the beach, a beautiful older style home with big windows overlooking the ocean. The kind of place you imagine when you think of a relaxing weekend by the sea. When we arrived, it was early afternoon. The sun was bright and warm, the salty air filled with the sound of waves crashing gently on the shore. The house looked perfect from the outside, well kept, but with that slightly worn charm that made it feel like a real home. We unloaded our bags, took in the view, and started planning our weekend. We figured we'd spend most of the time on the beach or cooking dinners together, maybe go out to a few local spots nearby. The inside of the house was just as nice as the photos. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a kitchen that was big enough for all of us to cook together. Everything was clean and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The furniture was simple but comfortable. Soft couches, a big dining table, a few decorative touches like seashells and framed pictures of the beach. It was perfect. After settling in, we all decided to take a walk down to the beach. The sand was warm under our feet and the water cool when we waded in. We spent a few hours there, just talking, laughing, and watching the sunset. It felt like the kind of weekend that would be easy to forget, but also exactly what we needed. That first night, nothing fell off. We ate dinner, drank a little wine, played some music, and then started settling down. The bedrooms were upstairs, with windows that looked out over the beach. I shared a room with one of my friends. We talked about how nice the place was before drifting off to sleep, the sound of the ocean like a steady background hum. The next morning after breakfast, one of my friends, Jake, noticed something strange. He was fiddling with the smoke detector in the living room. It was blinking. Normally, those things just beep if the battery is low or it senses smoke, but this one was blinking a steady, slow light. It caught his eye because it was different than the usual flashing when batteries were dying. He pointed it out, and we all gathered around. We looked closely. The blinking light was faint but consistent, almost like a small camera lens. It was tiny, barely noticeable unless you were right up next to it. Jake had a tech background, so he grabbed his phone and started trying to figure out if it could actually be a camera. It took a while, but eventually he managed to open up the smoke detector carefully, and inside, hidden where no one would expect, was a small camera device. It had a tiny lens and some wiring leading to what looked like a wireless transmitter. We froze. None of us could believe it. A hidden camera in the smoke detector in the living room? The first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe a weird security setup from the host, but it didn't feel right. None of US had agreed to any surveillance in the private areas of the house. We all knew that some rentals had cameras outside for security, but inside was a big no-no. That discovery set off a chain reaction. We started checking every room carefully. The bedrooms, the bathrooms, the kitchen, anywhere we could think of. In the second bedroom, Jake found another camera hidden in a small air vent near the ceiling. It was even smaller and trickier to spot, but it was definitely there. In the bathroom, there was nothing visible at first, but after looking closely, we noticed a tiny hole drilled into the wall above the shower. We took a flashlight and looked inside. There was another lens hidden behind the hole, aimed right at where someone would stand in the shower. By then, our mood had shifted completely. We weren't on vacation anymore. We felt violated and scared. The thought that someone had been watching us in the most private moments was deeply unsettling. None of us slept that night. Instead, we sat up in the living room, pulling out our phones, taking pictures of the cameras and the suspicious spots in the house. The next morning, we contacted the local police. We told them everything, showed them the cameras and the spots where we found them. The officers took the situation seriously. They came to the house, collected the cameras as evidence, and started an investigation. It turned out the host had installed several hidden cameras throughout the house, including in the bedrooms and bathrooms. without informing any guests. The police explained that this was illegal. Homeowners and Airbnb hosts are not allowed to record guests in private areas, and anyone caught doing so can face serious charges. We learned that there had been other complaints against this host from previous guests who had noticed strange things but hadn't found the cameras. We pressed charges, and the host was arrested a few days later. The investigation revealed that the cameras had been active for months, streaming footage directly to the host's phone. The thought of how many people had unknowingly been recorded in this supposedly safe place was disturbing. The whole experience left a mark on us. At first, we wanted to forget about it and move on, but we couldn't ignore the feeling of violation. We talked about how easy it was to be caught off guard, how important it was to trust your instincts and look out for signs when renting places, no matter how nice they seem online. After the police cleared everything, we stayed a little longer in town, renting a different place, one with no surprises. We spent the last days of our trip together on the beach, trying to relax and reclaim the peaceful feeling we had come for. In the end, we shared our story publicly to warn others. We wanted people to know that even places that seem perfect can hide dark secrets. We learned to be cautious, to inspect places carefully, and never to ignore strange signs. The experience was frightening, but it also brought us closer together. We supported each other through the fear and uncertainty, and we made sure that this host would no longer be able to hurt anyone else. We didn't let the fear win. Instead, we stood up for ourselves and took action, and that made all the difference. I was on a tight budget when I booked my Airbnb for the weekend. The city was huge, expensive, and almost everything close to downtown was way out of my price range. After hours of scrolling and searching, I finally found a place that was cheap enough, a basement apartment in a pretty old building right in the middle of the city. The picture showed a small but clean room, and the host had decent reviews, nothing glowing but nothing bad either. It was perfect for what I needed, just a place to crash after work events and sightseeing. When I arrived, the building itself looked a bit run down. The brick outside was chipped and grimy, and the front door had a rusty old lock. I called the host from the street, and he told me to use the side entrance and gave me a code for the keypad. The side door was narrow, barely lit by a flickering bulb, and the steps leading down were steep and made of concrete. It felt like I was entering some forgotten part of the city. The moment I stepped inside the basement, I was hit by a cold, damp smell. The air was heavy and stale, and it was much colder than the outside. The only light came from my phone's flashlight. There was no window down here, just thick stone walls that swallowed the light and made everything feel deeper in the dark. I flicked the switch for the main light. Nothing happened. I tried the second switch, still nothing. The place was pitch black except for the thin beam from my phone. I pulled out my jacket and tried to shake off the chill, then started to explore the small basement. The walls were rough, made of old bricks and mortar, and I noticed the floor wasn't smooth but cracked and uneven. What really caught my attention were the chains and old, rusty locks hanging from several hooks on the walls. Some chains were thick and heavy, others looked thinner but still strong. The locks looked like they hadn't been used in decades, but the metal was still solid. At first, I thought they were just decorations or maybe left behind by some previous tenant. I even tried to take a closer look, running my fingers over the cold metal. Later, I asked the host about them through a message. His reply was short, almost dismissive. He said something like, "Old stuff from the building's past. Nothing to worry about." That vague answer didn't really satisfy me, but I didn't press further. I figured old buildings sometimes had weird relics hanging around. That night, I barely slept. The cold kept me awake more than anything else. The basement didn't have much insulation, and the little heater they left wasn't strong enough to warm the entire space. Every sound was amplified in the silence. The hum of the city outside, the occasional creak from the floorboards above. I kept thinking about those chains and locks, how out of place they seemed for a basement apartment. The next morning, I decided to step outside and maybe explore the neighborhood a bit. I was standing by the front door when I ran into an elderly man on the sidewalk. We started talking casually, and I asked him about the building. He paused and gave me a strange look before telling me something I wasn't expecting. He said the basement had a history, a long, dark one. Back during Prohibition, the basement was used by local law enforcement and bootleggers alike. It wasn't an official jail, but a makeshift holding cell where criminals were kept temporarily before being moved or released. The chains and locks I saw were probably used back then to keep prisoners restrained. The basement was notorious in the neighborhood, a place where many people had been locked up, sometimes for days. He explained how the basement wasn't just a storage space or an apartment. It was a reminder of a rough time in the city's history. The walls had witnessed fights, fear, and people waiting for their fate behind those cold bricks. The old man said the building had been renovated several times, but they never removed those chains and locks, maybe as a warning or simply because they were too much trouble to take down. Hearing that, everything about the basement suddenly made sense. The cold, the darkness, the old chains. It wasn't just an odd choice for a rental. It was a place with a past that still lingered in its very structure. I couldn't shake off the feeling that the building itself carried the weight of all those tense, desperate moments from nearly 100 years ago. I went back down to the basement and took another look. The silence was heavier than before, and the walls seemed even colder somehow. The chains clinked softly when I brushed against them, and I imagined how those sounds might have echoed back when the basement was a holding cell. The thought made me uncomfortable. This wasn't a place meant to be lived in. Not really. It was meant for punishment and confinement. Without hesitation, I packed my things and left the apartment that day. I didn't tell the host why. I just messaged him that I was leaving early and needed a refund. He didn't argue. I spent the rest of the weekend at a cheap motel outside the city center. It was more expensive, but the warmth and natural light made it worth every penny. I learned that sometimes the cheapest option comes with more than just a low price. It carries history and atmosphere that you might not be ready to face. Looking back, I realize I've barely scratched the surface of that basement story. I didn't want to know more, honestly. The idea of sleeping in a place that once held people against their will, in cold chains on rough floors, was enough to make me move on. I didn't feel safe, not emotionally or mentally, even though there was nothing supernatural there. The real fear came from knowing what had happened there, from understanding the heavy past that still seemed to fill the air. I've stayed in plenty of basements, cheap rooms, and old apartments since then, but nothing ever made me want to leave as quickly as that basement in the city. It's strange how history can reach out and affect you, even decades later, in a place you thought was just another cheap place to stay. The chains on the walls weren't just metal. They were a reminder of a darker time, and that reminder was too much for me. I've been hiking all day through thick forest, far from any trails or signs of people. The kind of place where your boots sink into wet earth, and the only sounds are the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. I was alone, carrying a light backpack, planning to camp somewhere deep in the woods for one night before heading back to the main trail the next day. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pine and fir trees. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and there was a little stream nearby that made a quiet, bubbling sound. It was perfect for setting up camp, peaceful, private, and far enough from any path that no one would stumble on me. I unpacked quickly, pitched my small tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and made sure I had my flashlight and pocket knife within reach. I ate a simple dinner, some trail mix, a protein bar, and a few sips of water from my bottle. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. As I cleaned up and packed away my food, I made sure to store everything in my bear canister and hung it from a tree branch away from my tent. I knew better than to keep food near me at night. Once everything was set, I crawled into my tent. The walls were thin nylon, but enough to keep the chill out. The air was cool and damp, smelling like pine and earth. The sounds of the forest started to settle, distant frogs, the soft breeze moving the branches, the faint drip of water from leaves after a light rain earlier that day. I closed my eyes and after a while I drifted off. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I suddenly woke up. It wasn't a sound or a sudden movement, but a feeling, a deep, unsettling sense that I was being watched. I opened my eyes carefully, not wanting to make any noise. Outside the tent, the forest was dark, almost black except for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. And then I saw it. Two green eyes, glowing in the dark, staring straight at me. They were about 20 feet away, just beyond the edge of the clearing. The eyes didn't blink or move at all. They were fixed on me, unblinking and unyielding. My heart slammed in my chest. I was frozen. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. I just lay there, staring back at those eyes, trying to stay as still as possible. I didn't want to make the creature aware I was awake if it wasn't already. Minutes passed. 10, maybe more. Time felt stretched out, slow, like the weight of the forest was pressing down on me. The eyes never shifted, never blinked. They just stayed there, glowing like emerald fire in the blackness. I could barely make out a faint shape, the hint of a large animal's head, low to the ground, outlined against the darkness. After what felt like forever, the eyes slowly began to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually, like someone slowly dimming a light. And then, just like that, they were gone, vanished into the black forest, leaving only the soft sounds of night. I lay still for a long time after that, not wanting to move or make a sound. I kept my breathing slow and shallow, waiting to hear anything else, but the forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted back to sleep, though it was a light, uneasy sleep filled with the sounds of my own heartbeat and the rustling of the trees. Morning came, pale and misty. The sun rose slowly through the thick canopy, casting golden light onto the mossy ground. I stepped out of my tent, stretching and yawning, still feeling the tension from the night before. Curious and a little nervous, I started to look around the clearing. That's when I saw them. Large, fresh tracks pressed deeply into the soft earth around my campsite. The prints were unmistakable. They belonged to a cougar. There were several sets, two, one larger and two smaller. The large prints were probably the mother, and the smaller ones her cubs. The tracks showed they'd been circling the clearing, moving quietly and deliberately. They'd been there all night, close enough to watch me. I realized if I had moved suddenly or made a noise, I might have provoked them. And knowing what I know about cougars, that could have been deadly. I sat down heavily on a fallen log, the weight of what I'd just experienced sinking in. I had been so close to something wild and dangerous, and it had been patient, watching, waiting. Not aggressive, just curious or cautious, but still a predator with all the power and speed to attack if it wanted. The thought made my skin crawl. I carefully packed up my gear, making sure to move slowly and quietly, not wanting to disturb the area more than I had to. My mind was racing with everything that could have gone wrong. I kept replaying the moment I woke up, the green eyes in the dark, how I stayed frozen, and how lucky I was that the animal never lunged. I thought about how many people might underestimate the danger of camping alone in places like this. You read stories online, hear warnings, but until you feel that raw, primal fear, the presence of a top predator watching you from just a yard away, it's hard to grasp. I was lucky that morning. The mother cougar with her cubs didn't see me as prey. Maybe they were more scared of me than I was of them. Or maybe they were just waiting for me to leave. As I made my way back through the forest, keeping my eyes and ears open, I felt different. More aware, more respectful of the wilderness and its secrets. That night in the woods taught me one thing clearly. Nature doesn't care about your plans or your fears. It simply exists with its own rules and dangers. And when you're out there alone, you have to be ready to listen, watch, and most importantly, stay very, very still. I wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary that day. Just a quiet, solo hike into the backcountry, something I'd done countless times before. I'd taken off work early on a Friday, packed up the truck, and driven 3 hours into the mountains to reach the trailhead by mid-afternoon. The forecast looked good, clear skies, cold at night, but manageable. Late September always felt like a sweet spot in the Rockies. Fewer bugs, fewer people, and more peace. The plan was simple. I'd hike about 6 miles to a ridge I'd camped at once before. No official trail signs, but if you knew where to look, the route was clear enough. From the ridge, you could see a valley of golden aspens below, and to the west, a vast expanse of pine forest rolling toward distant snowcaps. It felt like being on the edge of something massive, wild, and untouched. I signed in at the trail registry. Nobody else had logged in that day. That comforted me. I like solitude. The trail climbed steadily through spruce and fir, and after the first hour, I passed the last fork that led to an official Forest Service campground. From here, the path became narrower and more rugged, overgrown, muddy in places. Exactly what I wanted. That's when I saw them. Boot prints. Big ones. Deep, fresh, heading the same direction as me. They weren't mine. I stopped and looked back. My own prints were clearly smaller and straighter. The ones ahead were made by someone heavy with a wider gait, maybe carrying a big pack. That in itself wasn't unusual. People hike this route, even if it's not popular. But something about the prints stuck with me. It wasn't just that they were fresh. It was how they wandered. The trail was direct, but whoever left those tracks had veered off several times. You could see patches where they stepped out of the main path, wandered to the edge of the trees, then came back. Not like they were exploring, more like pacing. I kept walking. No sense in letting myself get weird about it. By 5 p.m., I reached the base of the ridge. There's a rocky incline that requires some light scrambling. Nothing dangerous, but steep enough to get your heart rate up. When I reached the top, I dropped my pack and looked around. Empty. No tent. No smoke. No gear. But the boot prints were still there, circling a flat spot that was perfect for camping. I followed them for a bit. They looped around the overlook, came right up to the cliff's edge, then back toward the tree line and vanished. I set up my tent near the cliff like I always did, facing west to watch the sunset. I didn't see or hear anyone. I boiled water for a dehydrated meal, ate while sitting on a boulder, then watched the light fade. The aspens in the valley below looked like fire, burnt orange and yellow, flickering in the wind. It was beautiful. I tried to relax, but something felt off, like I was being watched. Not constantly, not an oppressive feeling, just moments. A prickle on the back of the neck, a tightening in the chest that would pass just as fast as it came. I told myself it was the altitude, maybe dehydration. But then, just after nightfall, I saw the light. A faint glow way down in the trees, maybe a quarter-mile back on the trail. A white headlamp beam sweeping side to side. I stood up. The person wasn't moving forward, just pacing near the base of the ridge. I waited. After maybe 30 seconds, the light blinked out. No movement, no sound. I stayed standing for a long time, eyes straining. But nothing came. Eventually, I crawled into the tent. I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the nylon and making the spruce trees creak. Every snap of a twig sounded like footsteps. I kept my knife beside me, not because I thought I'd need it, but because I didn't know what else to do. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, right outside the tent. A deep, slow exhale. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember is dawn light creeping into the tent. I got out, heart still pounding from whatever broken sleep I'd managed. The air was sharp and cold, frost on the fly sheet. I walked a slow circle around the camp. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Deep, fresh boot prints circling my tent. Twice. Not mine. Not the ones I'd seen the day before. These are closer together. Heavier. The same as before, but now they were here. On top of last night's frost. Made sometime between midnight and sunrise. I looked in every direction. Nothing moved. No birdsong yet. Just silence. I broke camp in record time. I didn't eat. Didn't make coffee. Just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking fast. I kept looking behind me every few minutes, but the trail was still empty. The sun climbed, and eventually the tension started to lift. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe someone else had come up late and camped in the trees. Maybe they were weird about privacy. Maybe. But then I reached the point where the boot prints had first appeared the day before. They were gone. Not faded. Gone. Mine were still there, plain as day. But the other set? Nothing. No prints heading back down. No prints turning off into the woods. Just vanished. That rattled me more than anything. I hiked the rest of the way without stopping. My legs burned. My back hurt. But I pushed until I saw the clearing and the trailhead sign. The parking lot was empty. My truck was the only vehicle there. No one had signed a logbook after me. I threw my pack into bed, locked the doors, and drove. Didn't stop until I hit town. That was 3 years ago. I haven't been back to that ridge since. I still hike, still love the woods, but I stick to marked trails now. Camp near others. I don't chase solitude the way I used to. Because sometimes, when you think you're alone out there, you're not. And sometimes, the people you meet in the wilderness aren't the kind you want to meet twice. The city buzzed all day long, but by the time night came, the streets outside my Airbnb were quiet, almost too quiet. I was staying in a downtown apartment, a modern, small place on the 3rd floor of an old brick building. The kind with creaky wooden stairs and a door that showed its age in chipped paint and rusty hinges. I had picked it because it was close to everything I wanted to see, and it looked nice in the photos. The host seemed friendly, and the place had good reviews, so I felt comfortable. I got in around 6 in the evening, tired from traveling. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows on the streets. I locked the front door behind me, tested it twice, and even checked the deadbolt. It was an old lock, but seemed to work fine. The apartment itself was cozy but plain. A small living room with a couch and a tiny kitchen with a stove and a fridge. The bedroom was in the back, separated by a short hallway. The windows faced a narrow alleyway between buildings. I figured I was safe. The building had a locked front entrance on the ground floor that you needed a code to open. I spent the evening unpacking, reading a little, and scrolling through my phone. The city's nightlife was lively just blocks away, but I decided to stay in early since I was drained from my trip. At around 10, I made some dinner and watched a show on my laptop. The walls were thin. I could hear faint sounds from the neighbors above and below, but nothing that bothered me. The creaks and groans of the building were familiar, almost comforting, like it was alive. I set my alarm for the next morning and prepared to go to bed early. I double-checked the door locks once more, locking the deadbolt firmly and pulling on the handle to be sure. Everything felt secure. I pulled the curtains shut, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. Midnight came quickly. I was half asleep when I heard it, a soft click like the sound of a door opening downstairs. My heart jumped in my chest. The building was old, so it wasn't unusual to hear noises, but this sounded different, clear and deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy steps coming up the stairs. They echoed through the quiet building, growing louder as they climbed. The stairs in the building were narrow, wooden, and creaked with every step. I could almost hear the floorboards bending beneath weight. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were steady, and they seemed to stop just outside my door. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and quickly texted the host. I typed something simple. I heard the front door open and footsteps coming upstairs. I'm locked inside, but I'm really scared. Is someone else supposed to be here? Almost immediately, a reply came back. No, no one else should be there. You locked everything, right? Stay safe and call the police if you need. I felt a cold wave wash over me. No one else was supposed to be there, but the footsteps were definitely real. I wasn't imagining it. I sat on the bed, trying to steady my breathing. The apartment was dark except for the light from my phone screen. The door to the hallway was closed, but I didn't want to look outside. I dialed 911, whispering my situation as quietly as I could. The operator assured me they would send someone right away. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, waiting for the police to arrive. My ears were straining for any sound. Minutes felt like hours. Then, I heard the door handle jiggle. Someone was trying to open my apartment door. The deadbolt was holding, but they kept at it, tugging and pushing, making the door creak. My heart pounded so loud, I thought the person might hear it. The police arrived quickly, sirens muffled outside. I unlocked the door and opened it for them. They swept through the apartment, checking every room and the hallway, but found no one. Outside, they examined the front door lock on the building and my apartment door. One of the officers pointed out that the lock on my apartment door had been tampered with. The latch was scratched and bent like someone had tried to pick or force it. They assured me that nothing seemed broken enough to get in, but the attempt was clear. They took a report and said they would increase patrols in the area. I thanked them, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The officer told me to stay somewhere else if I didn't feel safe. I ended up booking a hotel room across town for the night. I packed my things quickly, feeling watched even as I left the apartment. The thought that someone had tried to get inside while I was there made my skin crawl. The next day, I checked the apartment again during daylight. The scratches on the lock were more visible, and I noticed the front door to the building had a faint scratch near the keypad. Someone had clearly been trying to get in, and it wasn't random. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. I told the host what the police had said, and they apologized but didn't offer much explanation. I didn't return to the apartment. Instead, I cut my trip short. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. The building was old, and the locks were outdated, but they held. Whoever tried to get in that night was close, just outside my door. The thought that they might have gotten past the lock chills me even now. I still get nervous in quiet places, especially old buildings with creaky stairs. But that night taught me to trust my instincts and never ignore the small sounds that don't feel right. Locking doors is just the first step. Being ready to act when something feels off can save you. After that night, I changed the way I choose places to stay. I now check locks carefully, ask about security measures, and avoid old buildings with weak doors. It's scary to think how close I was to something worse, but I'm grateful that I was alert, that I called for help, and that no one got in. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the echo of footsteps in silence. And I remember how real fear feels when you're alone and the lock you trusted suddenly feels fragile. That night stayed with me, a warning I haven't forgotten. I set out early that morning, just as the first light of dawn was cutting through the mist that hung low over the forest. The air was cool and damp, and the smell of wet earth mixed with pine was thick and heavy. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a solo trip into a remote stretch of the national forest, far off the beaten path where the trails were barely more than animal tracks. I wanted to be alone, to feel the quiet that comes from being deep in the woods with no one around for miles. My pack was light but well prepared. Enough food and water for 2 days, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, compass, and a knife. I wasn't taking any chances, even though I knew the area pretty well from previous trips. This time, I wanted to test myself to see how far I could go without relying on marked trails or the GPS on my phone. The first few hours went smoothly. The forest was dense, but not difficult to navigate. I moved steadily uphill, careful to watch my footing as the ground grew rocky and steep. The sunlight filtered through the tall trees, making patterns on the forest floor, and occasionally, a bird would call out somewhere overhead. Every now and then, I stopped to take a sip of water or check my map. My heart was steady. I felt confident. By midday, I had reached a small clearing near the top of a ridge. I sat down on a fallen log and took out my lunch, a sandwich and an apple, savoring the quiet around me. From this spot, I could see the tops of the distant hills rolling away into the horizon. The wind whispered softly through the branches, and the sun was warm on my skin. I felt calm, at peace. After eating, I folded up the map and started moving again, aiming to circle around the ridge and find a small creek that was marked on the map. I wanted to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me back to a main trail several miles away. The trees thickened again, and the ground became wet and slippery as I made my way toward the water. That's when things started to feel off. The first sign was subtle, a quiet crunch underfoot, like dry leaves being stepped on. But I was alone, so it couldn't be anyone else. I stopped and listened carefully. The forest was still, except for the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of a crow. I shrugged it off and kept moving. Then I noticed broken branches snapped off at odd angles and disturbed patches of ground. Something had been here recently, but it wasn't a deer or any small animal. The prints in the mud were too large and too human-shaped, but not quite like a person's footprints. They were deeper and irregular, as if someone or something heavy had walked clumsily through the mud. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just some hunters or hikers who had passed through a day or two ago. No reason to be scared, but my eyes kept scanning the trees, looking for movement, for any sign of life. The creek was finally within sight, a narrow ribbon of water, dark and cold, flowing over smooth stones. I crouched by the edge and filled my water bottle, drinking deeply. The cool water refreshed me, and I felt a little better. As I stood up, I heard something else, a soft, low sound, almost like a growl. It was far away but unmistakable. My stomach tightened. It wasn't an animal I knew. Coyotes or foxes made different noises. This was rougher, harsher. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably a dog or some other animal. Still, I decided to move quickly, following the creek as planned, hoping to reach the main trail before nightfall. The forest around the creek was thick with brush and fallen logs. I had to duck under branches and step carefully over roots. My boots slipped once or twice on wet moss. The creek made a steady noise, a kind of rushing that covered up other sounds, which was good. It helped hide my own footsteps. After about an hour, the creek took a sharp bend, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just across the water, on the opposite bank, was a large pile of clothes. They looked dirty, old, and torn. I could see a jacket, a shirt, and a pair of pants tangled up in the branches of a fallen tree. I froze. The clothes didn't belong to me, and they looked like they'd been there for a while. But the idea that someone else had been here, possibly hurt or lost, made my skin crawl. I debated whether to cross the creek to check, but the water was deep and the bank on that side was steep and slippery. I decided to keep moving downstream, sticking to my original plan. If I found a trail or some sign of people, I could come back with help. The light was starting to fade. The forest was darker under the thick canopy, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I felt the pressure of time. I didn't want to be caught out here in the dark. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, crunching over dry leaves and twigs. They weren't fast, but they were steady. I stopped and turned quickly, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The beam cut through the trees, but only showed empty trunks and bushes. Still, the footsteps continued, always just behind me, never getting closer but never going away either. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but it was real, not in my head. I moved faster, stepping over roots and rocks, trying not to slip. The creek was still on my right, dark and rushing. The footsteps matched my pace exactly. I glanced behind again, and this time I saw a figure. It was dark, shadowy, just a shape moving through the trees. Not running, just walking. I picked up the pace, breaking into a run. The figure did the same. Panic took over. I ran harder, my breath coming in short gasps. I wasn't thinking about where I was going, just away from that shape behind me. Suddenly, the creek widened into a small pool, and the bank rose sharply ahead. There was no way forward without climbing. I scrambled up the muddy slope, slipping once and catching myself on a root. My pack shifted and threatened to pull me down. At the top, I paused, panting and looking around for a place to hide. The forest was silent except for my heavy breathing and the soft rush of the creek below. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed still, heart pounding, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, I crept forward, moving cautiously along a ridge that overlooked the creek. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but no signal. Of course, the sun had almost set by now. The sky outside the trees was a dull orange, fading to gray. I knew I had to find shelter and wait until morning. Trying to hike out in the dark was dangerous, especially with whoever or whatever had been following me. I found a cluster of trees where the ground was flat and cleared some leaves to set up my small emergency tarp. I tied it between two trees, enough to keep some rain off if it came. I sat down with my back against a tree trunk, knife in my hand, flashlight ready. The forest was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was near. Hours passed slowly. The stars came out, faint through the thick canopy. The night air grew cold and still. I heard nothing but the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant rush of the creek. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell asleep, or maybe just dozed with one eye open. At first light, I packed up and started moving again, sticking close to the ridge to avoid the thick brush by the creek. The forest seemed less threatening in daylight, though I still scanned constantly for signs of anything unusual. About 2 hours later, I found the trail I'd been hoping for. It was overgrown and barely visible, but clear enough to follow. Relief washed over me. I kept walking, moving steadily downhill, knowing the trail would lead me back to the ranger station in safety. When I finally saw the road and the small parking lot where my car was parked, I stopped and breathed deeply. I looked back at the forest edge, the dark line of trees stretching behind me, and felt a chill. I didn't know who or what had followed me that day, or why the clothes were left by the creek. Maybe it was someone lost, someone dangerous, or maybe just a hunter moving quietly through the woods. What mattered was that I had made it out. I locked my car doors and drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the forest fading behind me. The woods were quiet again, but I knew I'd never forget the feeling of being watched and the footsteps that kept pace just out of sight. I've hiked most of Southern California's well-known trails, but something about Big Bear always drew me back. Maybe it was the mix of elevation, clean air, and long stretches of pine forest where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. That October weekend, I wanted solitude, a break, some time to let my brain breathe. I've been working 2 jobs and barely sleeping. Something about the noise of daily life had become unbearable. Emails, phone calls, city traffic, even my own apartment. It all piled up into this low-grade hum of stress that followed me everywhere. So I drove out early on a Saturday morning, got to the trailhead for the Pine Knot Trail by 7 a.m., and parked in the chilly shade of the trees. I brought everything I thought I'd need: water, trail mix, jacket, headlamp, paper map, compass, and GPS. The plan was simple: hike Pine Knot out and back, maybe 6 to 7 hours total, depending on how often I stopped. There were no warnings, no closures. Weather was crisp and dry. All signs pointed to an easy day. The first few hours were perfect. I was alone, but not lonely. The trail wove through tall pines and over soft dirt paths littered with gold and brown needles. The air was cool, clean, and sharp in my lungs. I kept a good pace and stopped for lunch a little before noon. Just some granola and jerky on a rock ledge that looked out over the valley. That was the last time I felt truly at ease. As I packed up, I spotted a side trail just to the left of where I'd stopped. It looked fairly well used, narrow but not overgrown, and seemed to slope gently downhill, following the curve of the ridge. My paper map didn't show it, but my GPS screen, a little outdated but usually reliable, registered a faint line that looked like it might reconnect with the main trail farther down. I figured it was either a service road or an old firebreak path. It seemed to be heading in the same general direction I wanted to go, and it looked like it would shave off a mile or 2. I told myself it was probably just an alternate loop that hadn't made it onto the newer maps. So I followed it. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The trail was narrower, sure, but not difficult. I was weaving between trees, sometimes ducking under branches, but it was beautiful, quiet, and peaceful. After about 30 minutes, the terrain started to change. The path dipped more steeply, winding into a pocket of the forest I didn't recognize. The pine canopy thickened overhead, cutting out most of the sun. Still no sign of other hikers. I stopped and checked my GPS, but the signal had dropped completely. That's when the first real doubt crept in. I paused and took a deep breath. I told myself I'd just backtrack to the last known marker. But when I turned around and looked behind me, the trail seemed to have vanished. No distinct tread, no footprints, just pine needles and dry undergrowth in every direction. I walked a few paces back, looking for landmarks, anything to orient myself. But everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, shadows. It didn't take long before I admitted I was lost. Still, I didn't panic right away. I had a compass, and I knew if I could get myself heading west, I'd eventually hit the main road or a ranger-maintained trail. But the landscape was playing tricks on me. Slopes looked shallower than they were, shadows seemed to bend in weird directions, and each time I picked a route that looked promising, I ended up blocked by thick brush or steep drop-offs. I checked the time, 2:18 p.m. Sunset wouldn't be until around 6:30, but light fades fast in a forest, especially under dense canopy. I tried to pick my way uphill, hoping to find a clear vantage point, but the terrain was unrelenting, thick brambles, loose soil, fallen branches. I stumbled more than once, scraping my hands and knees. My water bottle slipped out of my side pocket during one fall, rolled down a slope, and disappeared into the undergrowth. That's when my heartbeat started to pick up. I had maybe a liter left in the other bottle. Enough for a few hours, not much more. Then came the sound. At first, I thought it was just wind, but it wasn't steady. It was rhythmic. It came from behind me, a crack. Crunch, pause, crunch like footsteps. I froze, crouched down behind a fallen log, and listened. Silence. I waited a minute. 2. Nothing. I stood and kept moving, faster now, feeling more and more off balance. Not just physically, but mentally. Something about the silence of the forest was starting to get to me. Every twig snap sounded like it came from 10 feet away. I'd spin around and see nothing. But the feeling of being watched, it crept in slow and steady, like cold air under a door. I started talking to myself, out loud. All right, keep calm. You're just off trail. You've got time. You've got gear. People hike off trail all the time and get out fine. But the forest didn't care. Around 4:15 p.m., I stumbled onto what looked like an old deer path. It was faint and barely more than a flattened line of leaves, but it headed west, which was good. I followed it. 10 minutes in, I spotted something that nearly made me shout with relief, an old wooden trail marker. Faded, cracked, and illegible, but definitely man-made. I stepped off the path to get a closer look. That's when I heard it again. A cough, not a loud one, dry, soft. Close. I stood dead still. My mind raced through possibilities. Another hiker? A hunter? Someone camping illegally? I waited. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voice. Just that one single cough. I slowly backed away and started walking fast, then jogging. The adrenaline kicked in, sharp and pure. I wasn't just lost anymore. I was spooked. I didn't know why exactly. It could have been a harmless backpacker, but my gut screamed otherwise. I found what looked like an old fire road, flat, wide, and carved into the hillside. No tire tracks, but it was the first real sign of human infrastructure I'd seen in hours. I followed it. No idea where it led, but it had to go somewhere. I walked that road for what felt like forever. Light started to dim. The temperature dropped fast. I could see my breath. My legs ached. I passed no signs, no forks, no evidence of life. Just more trees. Finally, around 6:30, I rounded a bend and saw a structure through the trees, an old ranger station or fire watch cabin. Small, wooden, boarded-up windows, and a tin roof. The place was abandoned, but there was a bench out front and a rusted fire road gate nearby. I collapsed onto the bench and just sat there, shivering, wiping sweat and grime from my face. I had made it out of the deep forest. I wasn't safe yet, but I was no longer completely lost. There was a note pinned to the door with duct tape. Emergency? Wait here. Patrol swings by at dusk. I looked at my watch. 6:41 p.m. I didn't know if that message was current or 5 years old, but it was something. I wrapped my jacket tighter, pulled on my headlamp, and waited. At 7:28, headlights appeared down the road. A patrol truck rolled up slowly, crunching over gravel. I stood and waved frantically. The driver, a middle-aged ranger with a gray beard, rolled down the window and called out, "You all right?" I laughed. I think I almost cried. I told him everything. How I veered off trail, lost signal, followed a path that didn't exist on any map, then heard something or someone following me. He let me into the cab, handed me a water bottle, and started driving back down toward the main trailhead. "You're lucky," he said. "You were maybe 3 miles off from Pine Knot. That side of the forest isn't maintained anymore. Used to be a ranger station down there, but it was decommissioned years ago. Trails got overgrown. People kept getting turned around. I asked if anyone else was out there, campers, hunters, hikers. He shook his head. Not officially, and anyone unofficial out there usually doesn't want to be found. He hesitated before continuing. Few years back, someone went missing near where you were. Winter storm rolled in. He got caught out. They found his pack weeks later, but never found him. I didn't say anything. He glanced over at me. Thing is, he said, the area you got lost in, that trail you followed, it's not on any current map because technically it doesn't exist anymore. I stared straight ahead, heart still thudding. I didn't tell him about the cough. I didn't tell him that I still had the sensation of being followed, even as we drove away. But I felt it, all the way back to my car, even as I started the engine, even as I drove back into town and checked into a roadside motel. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes and picture those woods, I can still hear the silence after that cough. The kind of silence that tells you you're not alone, even if you want to be. I booked a single-room Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The listing looked perfect at first glance. It was in an older, somewhat charming house that seemed well kept from the outside, nestled between two similar homes on a tree-lined street. The picture showed a clean, bright room with a large window letting in natural light, a simple bed with crisp sheets, a small desk, and a few shelves. The description promised a cozy, private room with access to a shared kitchen and bathroom. The price was fair, and I needed a place for just a couple of nights while I was working the area. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the street. The house looked just as it did in the photos, maybe even better in person. I rang the bell, and the host, a middle-aged man with a polite but somewhat stiff smile, greeted me. He had a clipboard and a key in hand, ready to show me inside. As I stepped through the front door, I noticed the house smelled a bit strange, sort of old and musty, but nothing too overpowering at first. The main hallway was dimly lit, with wood paneling that looked aged and slightly scratched in places. I followed him past the living room, which was filled with mismatched furniture covered in dust covers, and the kitchen, which looked functional but not very welcoming. The floors creaked under my feet as we moved down the narrow corridor. Then he stopped and opened a door I hadn't expected. It was a tiny, dark room that wasn't shown in any of the photos or mentioned anywhere in the description. The door opened inward, revealing a space so small it was almost claustrophobic. The walls were a dull, faded brown, covered with dozens of strange scratches and marks, some deep enough to catch the light in a way that made them look like scars. The air in the room was thick and smelled strongly of dampness and mildew, like it hadn't been aired out in years. There was no window, none. The only light came from a dim overhead bulb that flickered slightly as it turned on. The floor was bare, cold, and uneven in places. There was a thin mattress laid out on the floor, stained and worn, with a pillow that looked flattened and dirty. No desk, no chair, no shelf, nothing else in the room. I stood there for a moment, tried to process what I was seeing. The room was nothing like the listing. It wasn't even close. It felt more like a storage closet someone had decided to convert into a sleeping space, just to squeeze in another guest. I looked back at the host, but he didn't say anything, just stood there silently, waiting for me to react. I shook my head and stepped back into the hallway. The feeling of being trapped in that tiny room made my skin crawl. The scratches on the walls looked fresh in some places, and there was a lingering damp smell that felt unhealthy. I couldn't imagine spending even one night there. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it felt unsafe. I told the host I wouldn't be staying there and demanded a refund. He looked annoyed, but didn't argue much. I left immediately and found a nearby motel where I could book a room for the night. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that dark little room and how I had almost trusted the listing without questioning it. Later, I reported the experience to Airbnb. They investigated and found that the host had been listing the same house with different photos and misleading descriptions to hide the fact that some rooms were nothing like advertised. The dark, windowless room I saw was used to squeeze in extra guests without proper accommodations or safety measures. After several complaints from other guests, the host was banned from Airbnb permanently. The whole experience left me shaken but it also reminded me how important it is to trust your instincts and check the details carefully when booking a place to stay. It's easy to get caught up in good photos and cheap prices, but sometimes what's behind the door is very different. The lesson stuck with me. Always ask questions, look for honest reviews, and never accept a place that makes you feel unsafe, even if it means losing money or scrambling for a last-minute room. My gut told me something was off, and I'm glad I listened. From then on, I made sure to book places with clear, transparent listings and hosts who communicated openly. I've never encountered anything like that again, but every time I travel now, I remember the cold, musty room with no windows and the eerie scratches on the walls. Proof that sometimes the worst nightmare isn't a ghost story, but real life. About 3 years ago, I took a solo trip to southern Utah. I had just come off a long, stressful project at work, and I needed something quiet, something off the grid. I didn't want crowds or tour buses or any sort of forced social interaction. I wanted open space and silence, maybe too much silence in hindsight. I picked a remote slot canyon near Escalante. I'm not going to name it here, mostly out of respect for the land, and also because I'm not entirely comfortable recommending it to others, not after what happened. But it was one of those places that didn't show up on many maps, tucked behind BLM land with a small, weathered trailhead marker and nothing else for miles. You had to know it was there. The route was supposed to be a simple lollipop loop, down a dry wash in the canyon, follow the slots, then climb out and loop back around. Around 8 miles in total. I researched it online, read a few trip reports, and even called the local ranger office to ask about conditions. Everything checked out. No storms in the forecast, dry sand, stable rock. So I packed my day bag, plenty of water, first aid, GPS, headlamp, snacks, even a compact emergency bivvy just in case. I left a note on my dashboard with my route and time of return. Signed in at the trailhead register around 8:15 a.m. Weather was perfect, mid-50s, sunny, not a cloud in the sky. The descent into the canyon was easy, quiet, beautiful, and completely devoid of other people. I couldn't have asked for better conditions. The wash narrowed slowly over the course of an hour, the canyon walls rising steadily on either side. Light filtered down in golden beams, bouncing off sandstone in warm shades of orange and red. Around 10 a.m., I hit the entrance to the slot. It was maybe 2 feet wide in some places. The walls rose about 50 feet straight up, smooth and twisted from centuries of water and wind erosion. I had to take off my pack and walk sideways through some of the tighter spots. It was peaceful in a strange way, just me and the rock. That's when the sound changed. I noticed it gradually at first. My footsteps, normally soft and absorbed by sand, echoed back at me, but not in a crisp, matching way. It was delayed, off by just a fraction of a second, like someone else was walking a beat behind me. I stopped. The echo didn't. It sounded like one more step landed behind me after I came to a halt. I turned around. Nothing. Just the winding, twisting passage behind me. Shadowed walls and silence. I figured maybe it was the acoustics. Sound bouncing in weird ways. I'd read about that happening in tight canyon spaces. I took another few steps. Again, the echo felt strange. It wasn't even in sync. Like 2 sets of feet walking with me, slightly out of rhythm. I stopped again, slower this time. This time, nothing followed. I stood there a moment, staring back the way I came, heart ticking a little faster. I reminded myself it was just sound. Weird rock acoustics, like how your voice can carry in a cave. That's all it was. I pressed on. The canyon twisted tighter, the walls so close I could touch both sides at once. I squeezed through a couple of tight spots, one which had a strange, dark patch on the ground. Looked like burned soot or maybe old charcoal. Could have been from a fire, though I couldn't imagine who would have built one down there. Then I reached a wider pocket in the rock, a sort of bowl, like a chamber in the slot, about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. Sunlight trickled down through a slit overhead, but not enough to light the whole space. As I stepped into the chamber, I felt it again, like I wasn't alone. The silence was too heavy. My own breathing echoed louder than it should have. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the walls. One corner had some markings scratched into the sandstone. Not petroglyphs, but more like crude initials. Someone had carved TB, 1996, and underneath it, help. That made me pause. Help could mean anything. Could have been a joke. Or not. I heard something then. Not an echo this time. A cough. Dry. Raspy. Human. It came from behind me, back in the narrow part I just passed through. About 30 feet away. I turned fast. Hello. I called out, louder than I expected. Nothing. Is someone there? Still nothing. No voice. No footsteps. Just that one dry cough hanging in my memory. I waited a solid minute, straining to hear anything. My ears were full of my own pulse. Then I started backing away, slowly. I didn't want to run. Running made things worse in stories like this. Besides, if someone really was out there, I didn't want to provoke them. I climbed the next dry fall slowly, a 6-foot ledge with a good handhold. From the top, I looked back one last time. Just the shadows curling down the slot. Then I saw it. A figure. A shadow, really. Not clearly defined, but there was definitely something, a shoulder, a head, peeking out from behind the sandstone curve where I'd come from. It wasn't moving. Just there. I didn't call out this time. I moved. Quietly. Quickly. The canyon opened up again after another 100 yards. The walls dropped and I could see the sky above me. Relief washed over me like warm water. I practically jogged the next section, checking my GPS constantly until I found the trail that looped back out toward the rim. I didn't stop again. I got back to my car around 3:45 p.m., signed out of the register. My legs were dusty and shaky, but otherwise I felt fine. The whole drive back to the little motel I was staying in, I kept turning that moment over in my head. The cough, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake it. That night, I sat in my motel room with the window cracked, listening to the wind blow through the cottonwoods. I finally called the local ranger office, not to report a crime or anything like that, but just to say, hey, I saw someone out there. I think they might have been camping illegally, or maybe they were lost. The ranger I spoke with listened carefully. When I mentioned which canyon, there was a pause. You were hiking that loop solo? Yeah, I said. Didn't see anyone all day until, well, maybe I didn't see anyone. I'm not sure. People see things out there sometimes, the ranger said, especially in those slots. Sound and shadow plays tricks. I agreed, said it must have been just that. But before we hung up, he added something else. There's been some talk over the years, he said. Not official reports, really. Just hikers saying they heard voices. Saw figures where there shouldn't be anyone. It's never amounted to anything. But there was a missing person case back in 2001. Guy went hiking solo and never came out. That stuck with me. About a week later, I got a voicemail from the same ranger. He said a search and rescue team had gone to check the area. Routine sweep. They do them every so often. About a half-mile from the rim, on a high shelf above the main slot, they found an old campsite. I called him back to ask about it. He said it was run down, tent collapsed, fabric shredded, half buried under sand. A rusted cooking pot, empty cans, and a notebook. Most of it was ruined, but a few pages had legible writing. Not detailed journal entries, more like short thoughts. Confused ones. Things like, day 6, sun too hot, no one here, heard someone walking again, try to find them, can't climb out, waited too long, still hearing footsteps, and the last legible line, am I Echo or is Echo me? They never identified the person. No body, no ID, just traces. They assumed it was either the missing hiker from 2001 or someone else entirely who'd never been reported. I haven't hiked a slot canyon alone since then. I still hike, still love the desert, still trust the land. But I carry a satellite beacon now, and I never ignore those gut feelings anymore. There's something deeply lonely about being that far removed from the rest of the world. A canyon like that can swallow you up, body, mind, and even your sense of time. But what stays with me the most is how real it all felt. The cough, the echo, the shadow that didn't move, and the possibility, however slim, that someone might still be out there, lost in the maze of rock, waiting for someone else to make a wrong turn. Back in the spring of 1994, I took a trip out to Suches, Georgia, with a small group of friends. Suches is one of those quiet, off-the-beaten-path spots in the North Georgia mountains. Nothing fancy, just deep woods, a few clearings, and plenty of space to stretch out and disappear for a while. We'd gone camping there a few times before, and the sites were pretty primitive but well-defined, with large spaces between them, so you could feel like you were alone, even if there were others around. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the thick pine and oak trees. The air had that fresh, slightly damp smell that spring brings, the mix of moss, wet earth, and budding leaves. When I pulled into the parking area, I saw that a couple of good friends, Kate and Ted, were already set up. They were one of the pairs I camped with the most. Kate was always energetic and friendly, and Ted was a big, solid guy who didn't say much, but was reliable as hell. I was in a good mood, hiking up the short trail to their campsite with my pack bouncing on my back, whistling a little tune under my breath. As I rounded the last bend and came into their clearing, something felt off. It was subtle at first. Kate was standing near the tents, but she wasn't her usual bright self. Instead, she had this wide-eyed, almost scared look. I mean, she was trying to hide it, but I caught it immediately. Then I noticed Ted standing a little ways off, near the edge of the campsite, talking to a man I'd never seen before. The guy looked out of place, like something straight out of a nightmare. He was dirty, with wild, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were torn and stained, like he'd been living rough for a long time. He had these eyes that didn't seem to look at you, but right through you. I remembered one of those old news reports about cult leaders. David Koresh was the first name that popped into my head. That's what this guy reminded me of, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Kate saw me looking and whispered, almost in a panic, "This dude won't leave us alone." Her voice was barely audible, and I could tell she was trying not to freak me out, but wanted me to understand the situation. From what I gathered, this man had been camping nearby alone for days, maybe weeks. He was lonely and seemed to latch on at anyone who showed him a bit of attention. Ted had tried to talk to him a few times, but the guy just wouldn't take the hint. It was like he thought we were all his friends now, whether we liked it or not. The day went on, and this guy was all over the place, trying to insert himself into everything we did. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just lonely, maybe a little off mentally. But the more he stayed close, the more uncomfortable everyone became. When we started prepping for dinner, the big event of the trip, our camping tradition, he showed up with a cooler. Most of us had brought food to share: steaks, vegetables, foil-wrapped potatoes, and some beers. But his cooler was something else. He opened it up and showed us his dinner plan: a raw steak floating in water that was stained red with blood. There were a couple of beers next to it, but the whole thing looked so grim and strange that we all just stared, not knowing what to say. Two other friends arrived while this was happening, and their faces said it all. WTF? We tried to keep it friendly but firm. We had our own food, and the guy's presence was making us uneasy. So Ted, being the biggest and most confident, decided to step up and set some boundaries. He approached the man and explained that we had our own space and that our meal was planned carefully. Ted was polite but firm, trying not to escalate things, but making it clear the guy wasn't welcome to join our group. Surprisingly, the man backed off a little after that. He seemed embarrassed, like he finally understood he was intruding. We all felt a bit relieved and even a little sorry for him. Loneliness can mess with people. The night started to settle. We ate, drank, and laughed around our campfire. The woods grew quiet, except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant calls of night birds and insects. It was the kind of night where the darkness feels heavy and alive, but in a natural way, not scary, until it wasn't. Out of the shadows came the man. We hadn't seen him for a while, and suddenly he was just there, stepping into the circle of firelight like he belonged. No warning, no knocking or asking. He sat down right in front of the fire, close enough for us all to see him clearly. What made the hair on my neck stand on end was what he held in his hand, a huge Desert Eagle pistol, the kind of gun that's heavy and powerful, the kind you don't mess with. He held it loosely, his finger resting casually on the trigger. No one moved. No one said a word. The fire flickered on his face, showing that wild, haunted look in his eyes. Then, without any change in his voice or expression, he asked if anyone wanted to check out his gun. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. No one dared say yes. Then my friend Dave broke the tension with a simple nope. No thank you. The man just nodded, as if that was the answer he expected all along. He stood up, took his gun, and walked away, disappearing into the darkness without a flashlight or a sound. We all sat frozen, watching until we couldn't see him anymore. About 30 minutes later, from the direction of his campsite came a sudden bright glow. A fire had been set, huge flames licking the night sky, towering over the trees. At first, we thought maybe it was an accident, but then we saw the figure moving in the firelight. The man was hopping around the fire, completely naked, holding a gas can. From our distance, it looked like he was deliberately throwing gas on the fire, making it flare higher and higher. The way he moved was frantic, wild, like some kind of madness had taken hold of him. It was one of those moments where you can't look away, but you know you should. The flames grew hotter, casting long shadows that danced on the trees around us. After about 30 minutes of this strange and terrifying show, the man suddenly stopped. He stood still for a moment, then quietly vanished into the woods. The fire died down as quickly as it had flared, leaving only glowing embers and a strange, smoky silence. We stayed up late that night, none of us able to sleep fully. Every little noise in the woods made us jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. We kept checking our surroundings, making sure our tents were secure, and listening for any sign of the man's return. Morning came slowly, with sunlight filtering through the thick canopy above. We went out to his campsite, half expecting to find something left behind, some clue about who he was or where he'd gone. Instead, all we found was a melted red and yellow plastic gas can, scorched and warped from the fire. He was gone. The rest of our trip passed without incident. We kept to ourselves, sharing stories around the campfire and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to us like a shadow. Despite the strange encounter, we managed to enjoy the woods, the fresh air, and the company. But every once in a while, someone would glance toward the edge of the trees and catch a glimpse of something, or maybe just a trick of the light, and the silence that followed was louder than any words. That experience stuck with me long after we packed up and left Suches. It was a reminder that not everyone who lives in the woods is friendly, and some people carry darkness with them that no amount of kindness can reach. It was real, it was raw, and it was terrifying. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. I just had the urge to go off the trail. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe boredom. We've been hiking Palo Duro Canyon for a couple of days, camping in a more remote part of the park. Not completely out in the middle of nowhere. There were still other campers a few miles away, and the trail wasn't far, but far enough that you felt like you could vanish out there and no one would notice for days. I like that feeling. I've always liked pushing into places people don't normally go. That day, the sun was high, maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and the wind was picking up like it does out there sometimes, all dry and sharp, cutting through your clothes no matter how hot it is. I left the trail just past a sharp bend, walking along a ridge that looked like it led to a small drop-off or ledge. I didn't tell my wife I was heading off. She was back at camp taking a nap. We'd already been hiking for most of the morning, and I still had a little left in me, so I figured I'd do some exploring and be back before she even noticed I was gone. I had my day pack, just a small one with some snacks, a water bottle, a flashlight, and a compact first aid kit. I didn't think I'd need any of it, honestly. I just wanted to stretch my legs and look around. The terrain out there is red clay and loose rock, with some scrub brush and little caves formed in the cliffs. It's all dry and dusty, with this brittle, ancient silence that settles on everything. The kind of place where your footsteps sound loud, even when you're trying to be quiet. The wind echoes in weird ways, bouncing off walls and into gullies so that you can't always tell where it's coming from. The day was blowing hard enough that you could feel the grit getting in your teeth, sticking to your sweat. I walked maybe 2-3 miles off trail. Nothing crazy, just a slow wander along what I thought was a solid route. I stayed up high, following the edge of a narrow ridge that gave me a view out across the canyon. Every now and then I'd spot one of those little cave mouths, most of them too shallow or too narrow to get into, just places where the rock had eroded over time. I kept going, probably farther than I should have, but I didn't feel tired. It was one of those days where everything feels still, where you think nothing can go wrong because nothing has yet. Then the ground gave out from under me. There was no warning. One step it felt solid, and the next I was falling. It wasn't a dramatic, tumbling fall like in the movies. It was more like the earth just opened up and took me in. The red clay crumbled beneath my feet, and I dropped straight down into this narrow chute. My boots scraped against the sides, loose rock and dust came with me, and I slid hard, maybe 10 or 12 feet in a matter of seconds. Just a steep, tight, dusty shaft that seemed to go deeper than it had any right to. I didn't even have time to yell. The chute was only a couple of feet wide, narrowing as it went down, and my pack, thank God, jammed up between the walls and stopped me. The bottom of the chute just vanished into black. I don't know how far it went. I don't want to know. If I hadn't been wearing that pack, I would have slid all the way down. It could have been 20 feet, 50, maybe more. The canyon's full of those weird formations, old erosion channels and hollowed out spaces you'd never know were there unless you dropped into one. My heart was racing so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't have time to. I just froze. The wind howled faintly above me, but down in that chute, it was dead silent. Just the sound of dust settling and my own breathing, loud and fast and panicked. My arms were pinned at my sides by the pack, and I could feel my legs dangling. My feet couldn't touch anything solid. There was nothing below me but air and darkness. I stayed like that for maybe a minute, maybe 5. I don't know. Time does weird things when you're terrified. My mouth was dry, and I could feel the red dust in my nose, my eyes, everywhere. I wanted to scream for help, but I knew no one would hear me. Not out there. Not that far off trail. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. If I fell deeper, no one would find me. Not in time. Probably not ever. Eventually, my brain started working again. I told myself I had to move. Slowly, carefully I tried to shift. My left shoulder was wedged tighter than the right, and I used that to my advantage. I dug my elbow against the wall of the chute and tried to inch upward. The clay crumbled every time I pressed against it, but I kept trying. Shimmying upward wasn't easy. The chute wasn't straight, it twisted slightly, and every movement felt like I might lose what little hold I had and slide deeper. It took everything I had, every muscle in my arms, my back, my legs straining to push and wedge myself higher. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't lift my head more than a few inches. I had to twist my body and push in these weird angles, 1 inch at a time, each one taking more effort than the last. My boots kept slipping against the walls. Every time I made a little progress, I'd slide back an inch or 2. My fingers scraped against rough stone. My knuckles split open. I didn't even notice until later that I was bleeding. I don't know how long it took. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe longer. But finally, I felt air on my face. Real air, not the stale, dry stuff that had filled the chute. I reached up and touched open space. I found a root, just a little thing but strong enough, and used it to haul myself up over the edge. I rolled out onto solid ground and just lay there for a while, breathing dust and staring at the sky. The sun had shifted. I could tell I'd been down there longer than I thought. I was shaking. My hands were filthy and scraped raw. My legs were covered in red clay, and my pack was torn at one of the straps. But I was out. I was alive. I looked back at the hole I'd come out of, and I couldn't believe it. You couldn't even tell it was there unless you were right on top of it. The chute was hidden between 2 crumbling ridges, just a crack in the ground. A little darker than the rest of the dirt. Maybe, but otherwise invisible. I tried marking it with a rock, something, but everything blended together in that dry, red landscape. I felt this deep chill, even in the heat, because if it had swallowed me whole, no one would have ever found me. I stood up, got my bearings, and made my way back to camp. My legs were jelly, and I kept stumbling. I don't even remember the walk clearly, just that it felt like it took forever. The whole way, I kept turning around to try and memorize the spot where I'd fallen. But everything looked the same. Ridges and rocks, dry clay, twisted brush. Nothing to tell one part from another. When I got back, my wife was still in the tent. I cleaned up quietly and didn't tell her right away. I just sat there for a long time, drinking water, staring at the dirt. Finally, I told her what happened. She didn't believe me at first. Who would? I didn't have pictures. There wasn't a scratch on my clothes besides the dirt. But she saw my hands. She saw my face. The next day, I took her out there, or I tried. I was so sure I knew the spot. I retraced my steps from where I'd left the trail, followed the ridge, past the same rock formations. Everything looked familiar until it didn't. We searched for over an hour, looping around, backtracking, climbing up and down. We never found the chute again, not even close. The whole area looked different in the daylight, less like a place and more like a memory I couldn't quite grab onto. It messed with me, still does. I love caves. I love exploring tight, dark places most people avoid. But this was different. This wasn't a cave. It was like a mouth in the earth, waiting to swallow someone. And it almost did. I wasn't being reckless. I wasn't doing anything extreme. I was just walking. That's the part that gets me. How easy it was to disappear. It made me think about how many people go missing out in places like that. You always assume they must have made some huge mistake, gone off trail, done something stupid. But now I know sometimes the ground just gives way. Sometimes the land itself doesn't want you there. And if it catches you, it doesn't have to try very hard to keep you. I still hike. I still camp. But I stay on the trail now. And when I do go off, I tell someone exactly where I'm going. I carry more gear. I carry a beacon now, something that can send an SOS if I get stuck. I've learned how fast things can go wrong. It's not about fear. It's about respect. Respect for the land, for your limits, for the fact that you're not invincible just because you've done something 100 times before. I've crawled into tight cave systems, rappelled into sinkholes, explored lava tubes, and never felt the way I did in that chute. That was the closest I've ever come to disappearing. And I mean really disappearing. No trail, no witnesses, no sign. Just dust and time and red clay. I think about that moment a lot. That 1 second where my foot hit soft ground and everything dropped out from under me. It taught me something important. You don't get to go wherever you want, just because you want to. Even the wild places deserve your consent. And sometimes, they don't give theirs back. About 8 years ago, I set out on a road trip that would take me from southern Ontario all the way down the eastern coast of the US, then across the southern states to California. I was alone, driving a reliable old sedan packed with camping gear, clothes, and a few essentials for the trip. I planned to see as much as I could, stopping wherever looked interesting. The idea of camping and hiking in new places was a big part of why I did this. I'm an experienced backpacker, mostly in boreal and mixed forest back home, where rain and cold weather are common, and I know how to handle rough conditions. But this trip took me in a new territory, both literally and figuratively. When I reached Utah, I made a spontaneous decision to spend some time in Bryce Canyon National Park. I had seen pictures before, those towering red hoodoos, the steep cliffs, and the vast open sky. I wanted to hike through the canyon and camp overnight near the bottom, imagining clear skies and the quiet solitude of the desert night. I drove into the park during the late afternoon and parked near one of the trailheads that led down into the canyon. My pack was heavy, filled with all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water. I had plenty of water, which I knew would be important in such a dry place. The air was dry and warm, but there was something different about the light, the sharp edges of the rocks, and the way the wind blew dust across the trails. It was nothing like the thick forest I was used to, where the ground is soft with pine needles and moss. Here, the dirt was hard, cracked, and dusty. The plants were scrubby, sparse, and tough, clinging to life in this harsh environment. The hike down into the canyon was steep, but not difficult. The trail switched back through bright orange and red rock, with views opening up behind me as I descended. I kept an eye on the sky, which was mostly clear, but far off to the west, I noticed a line of dark clouds building. I didn't think much of it. Where I come from, Rain clouds are a regular thing, and you learn to expect sudden weather changes. But in the desert, rain is rare and usually gentle, so I thought it might pass or at worst be a short shower. I found a flat spot near the base of the canyon that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was surrounded by tall, jagged hoodoos that rose like towers, casting long shadows in the fading sunlight. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt with some loose stones. I pitched my tent carefully, anchoring it securely because of the occasional wind gusts. I unpacked my stove and prepared a simple meal, watching as the light dimmed and the shadows grew longer. The air cooled quickly now, a dry cold that felt sharp in my lungs. About an hour after I'd settled, I started to notice a faint sound, a trickling noise coming from a small gully nearby. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, or maybe a small stream hidden in the rocks. Then I looked down and saw a thin line of water running over the dusty ground, just a tiny trickle moving past my feet. I didn't worry at first. Water is a common sight in the forest when it rains, and little streams start from puddles all the time. But in this dry place, it felt strange. I looked back up toward the sky, and those clouds were definitely getting darker and thicker now. A soft wind had picked up, carrying a cool dampness that smelled faintly like rain. Within minutes, that small trickle of water began to grow. It spread quickly, like someone had turned on a faucet underground. The thin line became a shallow stream, moving faster and wider. The ground beneath my feet, which had been dry and firm, was now softening with mud and wet sand. I took a step back and realized something that sent a chill down my spine. I was standing at the bottom of a canyon that was about to fill with rushing water. The desert floor looked innocent enough, but I remembered that the ground was hard-packed and barely absorbed water. The rain that fell anywhere above would run off quickly down the slopes and cliffs, funneling into this narrow canyon. This wasn't going to be a gentle creek forming. This was going to be a sudden, fast-moving river. I started moving fast, throwing my gear into my pack as the water spread rapidly around my campsite. The small trickle at my feet was now a wide band of flowing water, thick with mud and small debris. The sound changed too, from quiet dripping to a roaring rush. I could hear rocks tumbling in the current, and the wind was picking up, carrying stinging drops of rain. I scrambled up the trail, climbing the steep slope as fast as I could. My boots slipped on a loose rock and mud. The water was rising quickly behind me. Turning the trail, I had just hiked down into a dangerous, slick slope. Looking down, I could see the area where I had just been. Now completely underwater, the ground washed away, rocks tumbling in the surge. My heart was pounding. I realized that if I had stayed even a minute or two longer, I might have been trapped by this sudden flash flood. The steep canyon walls meant there was no easy escape except the narrow trail I was climbing. If the water had cut me off or swept me away, I wouldn't have stood a chance. Finally, I reached a flatter spot near the rim of the canyon, where the water couldn't reach. I collapsed against a rock, breathing hard, soaked and trembling. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and relentless. The sky was dark, filled with heavy clouds that rumbled in the distance. Lightning cracked somewhere far off, but here it was just the roar of the flood and the rain hammering down on the rocks. I sat there for a long time, watching the water pour through the canyon below. The trail I had just taken was now a river, cutting through the desert with a violence I had never expected. It was a stark reminder of how unpredictable nature could be, especially in places I thought I knew. That night, I stayed near the rim, in a sheltered spot under some overhanging rocks, waiting for the storm to pass. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and the scent of wet earth. I was soaked cold and exhausted but safe. The desert had shown me a side of itself I hadn't imagined, the sudden, raw power hidden beneath the calm. I think about that night often, how easily things could have gone wrong. It was a lesson in respect for the land and the weather, especially in places so different from where I grew up. In the forest, rain is normal, expected, and part of every trip. But in the desert, rain can turn the ground beneath your feet into a dangerous trap. I hadn't prepared for that because I hadn't thought about it. That almost cost me everything. A few months before that trip, I had another close call, but this time in the deep woods of Ontario's Algonquin Park. I was hiking late in the season with a small group, familiar with the area and the risks. We were walking a narrow trail surrounded by thick trees, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as we rounded a bend and suddenly spotted two small black bears crossing the path just a few feet ahead. They were cubs, young, curious, and unaware of us. They moved slowly, unconcerned, as if they owned the place. We didn't see any sign of mother nearby, but we knew better than to wait and find out. Bears with cubs are extremely protective, and any wrong move could trigger a dangerous reaction. We stood frozen, watching as they crossed the trail and disappeared into the underbrush. Our hearts were pounding, adrenaline flooding through us. The bear's claws were sharp, their strength surprising for such small animals. Even though they were not grizzlies, just two black bear cubs, I knew instinctively that this was a moment to respect their space and get away quietly. We backed off the trail slowly, careful not to make sudden noises or movements that might attract attention. That encounter reminded me that nature's dangers are not just in harsh weather or remote places. They're in the wildlife, too, and sometimes the most ordinary moments can become tense and frightening. Both those experiences, the flash flood in Bryce Canyon and the bear cubs in Algonquin, taught me something important about wilderness and survival. No matter how experienced you are, no matter how confident you feel, the natural world can surprise you. It demands respect, constant attention, and humility. When I finally left Bryce Canyon, I was soaked and exhausted, but I carried with me a new awareness of how quickly conditions can change and how vital it is to stay alert. The desert looked peaceful again the next morning with blue skies and dry rock, but I knew better now. I knew that beneath that calm beauty, danger could arrive in an instant, changing everything. That road trip was one of the most challenging and rewarding adventures of my life, filled with moments of wonder and moments of real fear. And those moments, the ones where you face the raw power of nature and live to tell the story, are the ones that stick with you forever. I grew up in Wyoming, but for some reason, my family usually went camping in Colorado. I guess the mountains, they were just a little different, maybe a little bigger, where the air smelled different. We had this old 1976 Ford Country Squire, a big wood-paneled station wagon that was as slow as a turtle, but carried all our camping gear and people comfortably. I was about 12 years old, and it was the early 80s. The memories from that trip still stick with me like it happened yesterday. We were camped somewhere high up in the Colorado mountains. The night was cold, colder than I expected. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, shivering under my sleeping bag. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and makes you feel like you can't breathe right. I was in the tent with my brother, who was maybe a year or two younger than me. He was sound asleep, curled up beside me, but I was freezing. I decided to get out and go warm up in the car. The tent was cramped, and to get out, I had to drag my sleeping bag over my brother. I could hear him groan and mutter something about having to pee, but I knew it was just an excuse. He always wanted to tag along whenever I moved around. I pulled the tent flap open slowly, trying not to wake anyone else, but the cold hit me like a slap. Outside, the world was dark and the sky was a deep blue-black. The only sounds were the wind through the pine trees and the occasional snap of a twig. I stepped out, rubbing my arms to try to warm up. The ground was hard and frosty beneath my feet. I told my brother I was going to the car, but as I started walking, the first signs of dawn began to show up over the mountains. A faint, orange glow stretched across the tops of the pine trees and the rocky ridges. Instead of heading straight to the car, I paused and looked out toward the horizon. The light was soft and beautiful, the kind of early morning light that makes you feel peaceful even when the air is freezing cold. My brother wasn't convinced. He came out behind me, still yawning and rubbing his eyes. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I thought I'd stay up and watch the sunrise. I pointed to the light on the mountain. I was excited to see the day start because it made me forget how cold I was. He frowned and said, "That's not where the sun comes up. It comes up over there," and pointed in a different direction. I rolled my eyes, knowing he was just trying to argue because he was a Cub Scout and liked to be right. I was the older sibling, and it felt like my job to prove him wrong. So I argued back, telling him the sun had to be coming up where I saw the light. Our voices were quiet but loud enough to wake our parents, who were still sleeping in the other tent nearby. My dad poked his head out just enough to see the early light, and then his face changed. It wasn't just the dawn light. That bright orange-red glow was wrong, too bright and too angry for a simple sunrise. I remember the way his eyes narrowed, and he pulled the tent flap open wider, standing up fast. I could tell right away from the way he looked that he knew exactly what it was, a forest fire. The glow wasn't peaceful anymore. It was bright and spreading across the mountain. The sky behind it had started to turn dark orange, like the whole world was on fire. The smell of smoke was faint but sharp, even that early in the morning. I felt a chill run through me, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. It was fear. Without any delay, my dad began packing things up. We didn't waste time taking out anything from the tent or gathering more supplies. We just collapsed the tent as fast as we could, the poles banging against the ground, and shoved it and everything else into the back of the Ford. I remember the rough feel of the canvas and the crunch of the tent poles mixing with the rustle of sleeping bags and backpacks as we shoved everything in. My mom was quickly waking up too, moving fast but calm. My brother looked scared but tried not to show it. My dad climbed into the driver's seat, and the engine started with a grumble. The car was loaded, and we were ready to go. Dad didn't say much, just told us to buckle up and hold on. We headed down the narrow gravel road that led out of the campsite. The road was winding and steep, and the kind of place where if you lost control, you could easily fall off into a canyon or worse. There were no guardrails, just the dirt road hanging over the edge. The dust from the tires floated in the still, smoky air as we drove, and every few minutes, my dad glanced over his shoulder at the orange glow chasing us down the mountain. The fire was growing fast. The smoke thickened with every turn we took, filling the windows with a grayish haze. My throat started to scratch, and my eyes watered a little. I try not to look out too much because it made the whole situation feel worse. The trees on the mountainsides were dark shapes against the red sky, and every now and then, the orange flames would flare up higher between the branches. Dad kept his foot heavy on the gas, but the road was rough and slow going. He talked quietly, saying everything was going to be fine, that we were ahead of the fire, but I could hear the tension in his voice. The car's headlights cut through the smoke, but the world outside seemed like it was closing in around us. After what felt like forever, we saw the flashing lights of a game warden's truck coming out from a side road. Dad pulled the car over and rolled down the window. The warden spoke with Dad for a few minutes. He told us the fire was spreading faster than anyone expected and that he was going around evacuating campers from other sites. I remember the warden's eyes looking worried but trying to stay calm. We got back on the road, still moving as fast as we could. The fire was behind us, but the smoke was thick and choking, and the danger felt real and close. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the trees were burning, how fast the flames could jump from one place to another. The wind shifted, and suddenly the smoke pushed forward, blanketing everything in a dark cloud. The car's heater was on full blast, but the heat inside the car was nothing compared to the cold fear growing in my chest. I kept looking out the window, watching the mountain get smaller behind us, and hoping the fire wouldn't catch us. My brother sat quietly, clutching his jacket, not saying a word. We didn't stop until we were safely down the mountain, back on the main highway. The air was clearer here, and the sky looked less like it was burning. My parents finally let us relax a little, and I remember the relief washing over me like a wave. When we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we came to being trapped up there. I had seen people on the news talking about wildfires since then, the way fire jumps and moves so fast it can trap people in minutes. I'd watch those videos and feel a cold prick of fear in the back of my mind, remembering that morning when my family had to escape a forest fire in the Colorado mountains. That trip taught me a lot about how quickly things can go wrong out in the wild. You think you're safe, but nature has its own plans, and sometimes you have to move fast or risk losing everything. I don't go camping without thinking about that fire and the smell of smoke in the cold mountain air. It's a quiet reminder that no matter how much you plan or how strong you feel, sometimes survival depends on luck and quick decisions. Now, whenever I see footage of wildfires out west or in Canada, I feel a tiny part of me tense up. It's that memory of that bright red glow over the mountain and the panic in the car as we race down that winding road, the heat of the fire chasing us all the way home. It's a feeling that never really leaves you. It was late January when I headed up to the old family cabin to check my winter trap lines. The cabin sat at the edge of a long-dead logging road, a place tucked so deep in the woods that even the snowmobiles had a hard time reaching it. My dad and grandfather used it for decades, but these days I was the only one left running the line. I planned to stay 4 or 5 days, enough to make the rounds and reset anything that needed it. The snow was deep and fresh. Nobody had been back there since the last storm. I parked where the old road turned too narrow to drive and strapped on my snowshoes, hauling my sled of supplies through thick pine stands and across frozen creeks until the roof of the cabin came into view, sagging a little under the snow, but still holding strong. I unlocked the front door, stepped in, and shut it behind me. Then I bolted it like I always do and wedged the old board across the inner frame for good measure. A habit more than anything. There wasn't a soul for miles, and with snow this deep, if anyone had followed me and I'd have seen their tracks. But still, the cabin had always felt better sealed up tight. Inside, it smelled like dry pine and old firewood. Dust clung to the windows, and the air had a biting cold to it. I unpacked quick, got the stove going with kindling, and started bringing in logs from the woodpile just outside. The snow was falling again by evening, light and steady, the kind that adds up over hours. I spent that first night eating beans straight from the pot and going over my maps. When I turned in, I made sure the stove was banked, the lantern lit low on the table, and both the front and back doors were secure. The back door especially, I nailed that one shut from the inside years ago. It opened out onto a rocky ledge that dropped steeply into the woods. It hadn't been used in at least a decade. The next morning was cold and clear. I had breakfast, layered up, and spent the day checking the southern traps. Pulled in 3 pine marten and a half-frozen fisher, reset some snares, and made it back just before dark. I kicked off the snow from my boots, locked the door behind me, and shook off the chill. That night passed quiet. The stove glowed and crackled, and I let myself get comfortable, reading an old book by lantern light. It was the second morning I noticed something. My pack wasn't where I left it. I always drop it beside the stove to let any snow or ice melt off into the tin tray below. But it was off to the side, closer to the cot. I stared at it for a while, tried to remember if I'd moved it and forgot. Maybe I had. I shrugged it off and got on with the day. More traps that afternoon. Snow heavier now, harder to push through. I checked the upper ridges, nothing caught, just tracks winding in and out of the trees. I returned late, soaked with sweat and aching. Again, I locked the front door, checked the windows, and added a couple logs to the indoor stack. As I peeled off my boots, I noticed something strange. The laces were undone. I tied them tight, double knotted. I had to. Stumbling around in snowshoes with loose boots was a good way to break your ankle. I tried to think back, if I'd maybe loosened them without noticing. But no, I remember sitting down, unhooking my snowshoes, then kicking off the boots. They weren't untied when I did that. Now, they were. It sat in the back of my mind all night. The way the pack had been moved. The laces. Nothing big, but enough to itch in my brain while I tried to sleep. I told myself I was tired, maybe just not paying attention like I usually do. It had been a long day. Too long. Maybe I was just getting sloppy. That night, I made a point of going through everything carefully. I checked every latch, every nail. Nothing was disturbed. The back door was still shut and nailed tight. The windows were fogged from the inside and frozen from the out. No cracks, no breezes. I even opened the trap door to the root cellar to make sure nothing was hiding down there, but all I saw was old kin goods, a coil of rope, and a rusted shovel. I closed it, locked it, and shoved a stool over it just in case. I lit the lantern again, set it beside the bed, and banked the fire down low. I kept my boots beside me this time. I even laid the pack on the cot so I'd hear it if it shifted. And then the third night came. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. I remember the dark. That thick, heavy, kind of dark you get out in the woods with no moon and cloud cover. No light from the lantern. No glow from the stove. It was just black. I could hear the wind outside, a soft moan through the trees. Snow tapping gently against the windows. And I remember lying there, feeling strange. The kind of strange that makes you stop breathing for a second. Something was wrong. I sat up disoriented. The air was cold, too cold. The fire must have gone out. I reached for the lantern. My hand met nothing but the table's edge. I fumbled around, trying to find the box of matches, the base of the lamp, anything. And then I heard it, breathing. Not mine. I was holding mine. This was slow, steady, and close. Inches from my face. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the sound. A warmth, a presence, something real. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. I listened. In, out, in, out. I shot my arm out and swept across the table, found the lantern by feel, grabbed it, and lit the match with shaking hands. The flame caught on the third strike, and the small glass globe glowed orange. No one was there. Nothing beside the cot. No figure. No person. Nothing I could see. But my breath was steaming, and the back of my neck prickled like I'd just been watched. Then I turned. The back door was wide open. Nails pulled straight through the frame. Jagged splinters where the hinges had been. Snow was blowing it across the floor. A long trail of it, all the way to the cot. No footprints, just wind-driven snow. But I knew it hadn't been open when I went to bed. I knew it had been shut for years, sealed from inside, the boards hammered flat. I stood there shaking, holding the lantern like it could protect me. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the light on and sat in the chair by the stove, staring at the door. I thought about leaving right then, but I didn't want to walk out into that, into whatever had just walked out. When the sun finally started to rise, I packed my gear in silence. I didn't touch the back door. I left it open. I didn't fix the hinges or pick up the nails. I left them scattered on the floor. I locked the front door, snowshoes strapped on, and walked out without eating, without coffee, without a look back. Just walked. I didn't talk about it for weeks, maybe months. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the wind pushed the door open somehow, that the breathing was a dream. I told myself all kinds of things. But in spring, when the ice melted off the trails and the roads started to open, I went back. I needed to, just to see, just to prove to myself there was a logical explanation. The cabin stood just as I left it. The front door was shut but unbolted. The back door was still hanging open, the wind having stripped the snow clean away. The frame was twisted from the nails. I stepped inside. The air was stale, still cold, dust in the light. I checked everything again. Slowly, carefully, and then I saw the marks. On the inside of the front door, deep gouges in the wood. Parallel, claw-like, not animal claws, human fingers. Scratches in sets of 4, sometimes 5, dragged across the surface as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. Near the handle, near the bottom, even up high where no one should have reached without a chair. I leaned in close. Some of the scratches had small fragments still lodged in the wood. Curled slivers of nail, fingernail, human. I stepped back, heart pounding. Whatever had been in there with me wasn't trying to get in. It had been inside the whole time. Maybe hiding in the crawl space. Maybe in the root cellar, tucked behind old shelves. I don't know, but I know it was in there. Watching me, breathing next to me, moving my things. I haven't been back since. Haven't run the winter lines. I pull traps only during the shoulder seasons now. Cabin's still standing, far as I know, but I don't talk about it much. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway, and the ones who would, they wouldn't sleep easy either. I've been planning the trip for a while. I wanted to get far off the beaten path, away from shelters, away from other hikers, away from the noise of towns and trailheads and any cell signal. It had been a rough few months. I needed to clear my head. Just me, my pack, and the woods. I'd picked a section of forest I knew didn't get a lot of foot traffic, deep backcountry, miles from any established sites. I had enough food for 5 days and my GPS tracker. I'd left my itinerary with a friend back home, told her not to worry unless she didn't hear from me after 5 days. The first 2 days were uneventful. The terrain was steep and a little overgrown in spots, which meant fewer hikers came through. That was exactly what I wanted. I passed no one. I didn't even see any old boot prints on the trail. Every night, I picked a flat piece of ground far from any obvious trail, hung my bear bag, and fell asleep to the sounds of wind through the trees and the occasional far-off rustle of something in the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. On the third day, I made camp earlier than usual. I'd started to feel a little off, slightly nauseous, maybe from a water refill that hadn't fully purified or just from exertion and heat. I'd set up by a creek, filtered more water carefully, ate a dry granola bar, and curled up my sleeping bag around sundown. It was the kind of quiet you only find way out there. No engines, no dogs barking in the distance, not even planes overhead. Just the slow trickle of the creek and the whisper of wind in the branches. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I knew it was late because the fire was out and my watch, which glowed slightly when I tapped it, said 12:17 a.m. I hadn't needed to pee, I wasn't cold, and there was no loud noise that had jolted me awake. Just a strange, crawling feeling in my gut, like something was wrong. Then I heard it, a baby crying, not far off, not echoing through the trees like from a distant campsite or across a ravine. It was close, right outside my tent. My brain struggled to make sense of it. I just laid there in my sleeping bag, my heart suddenly hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The crying wasn't panicked or hysterical. It was steady, rhythmic. A bit too steady, actually. The first thing that hit me was confusion. There were no families out here. None. I hadn't seen a single hiker since I'd stepped onto the trail. There were no reports of missing people. I knew this because I'd checked the trailhead bulletin and the ranger site before I left. There was no way in hell someone would bring a baby out here. The second thing that hit me was the cold wave of fear. I stayed completely still. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a trap. Every part of me wanted to unzip it and scramble for my knife. But I waited. I kept listening. The crying continued for maybe another 10 seconds, then stopped. Silence. I stared at the roof of my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The silence dragged on so long, I started to think I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe it was some kind of animal that sounded like a baby. Then the crying started again. But this time it was different. It sounded flat, like the tone didn't change. No variation in pitch or volume. Not like a real baby. More like a recording. My blood went ice cold. I knew, in that instant, with total clarity, that someone was out there. Someone was trying to lure me out of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I laid there, still as stone, listening. The crying stopped again. For the next hour, I stayed like that. No sound. I heard a single branch snap at one point off to the side of the tent, but that was it. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. I waited, straining my ears. Every time a breeze moved through the trees, I flinched. Eventually, I worked one hand free and slid it toward the side pocket of the tent where my knife was. I gripped it hard, keeping the blade folded but ready. My hand stayed around it the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes. Every so often, I'd hear a twig crack or a faint rustle, but it was always too brief to be sure. Maybe an animal, maybe not. The worst part was the uncertainty. Not knowing who or what was out there. Not knowing if they were still watching me. Not knowing what would happen if I stepped outside. When the light finally started to shift through the trees, I still waited. I didn't move until the sun was fully up and the shadows had retreated. Only then did I slowly unzip the tent and crawl out, knife in hand. The air was still. The forest looked normal. Nothing out of place. But I didn't feel safe. I stood up and turned around to check the area, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. They were small. Child-sized. No tread, no socks. Just human feet, small and clean enough to make out the toes in the soft dirt. They circled my tent once, twice, maybe more. I couldn't tell how many loops. Some prints overlapped. They weren't deep, which meant whoever was had been light or very careful. But they were clear. Someone had been out there, in the dark, barefoot, walking around my tent over and over. I stared at them for a long time. The prints didn't lead away in a straight line. They just faded off into the underbrush toward the slope I'd come down the day before. No sign of where they started. No sign of anything else. I didn't break down. I didn't scream. I just packed up. I didn't bother eating. I didn't refill water. I didn't even roll my sleeping bag the right way. I just crammed everything into my pack, shouldered it, and started hiking out. I took the same path back I'd come in, but I didn't stop. I didn't rest. Every 5 minutes, I turned around, checking the trail behind me. Every noise made me whip my head to the side. I didn't listen to music or put in earbuds like I usually did. I wanted to hear everything. By noon, I was dripping sweat. My legs were shaking. I was dehydrated, but I kept moving. Every time I thought about stopping, I pictured those footprints. I pictured that crying, that flat, fake sound just beyond my tent wall. I kept my knife in hand the whole way back. Even when my hand cramped from holding it too tight, I didn't put it away. I made it to the trailhead just before dusk. I was exhausted. My knees were shot. My back ached. I looked like I'd been through hell. But I didn't stop until I hit the gravel parking lot where my car was still parked undisturbed. When I finally locked the car doors and sat down inside, I felt everything hit me at once. The adrenaline wore off. I started shaking. My eyes welled up, and I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the trees. I didn't call anyone. I didn't report anything. What I have said, someone played a baby recording outside my tent in the middle of the woods and left bare footprints. No one would have believed me. I barely believed it myself. But it was real. I've done dozens of solo hikes, camped all over. I've seen bears. I've had close calls with injuries and weather and getting lost. But nothing ever got under my skin like this did. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person, a real, breathing human being who hiked out into the woods barefoot, carrying a recording of a baby crying just to mess with someone. Or maybe worse. I don't know what their goal was. Maybe they were hoping I'd unzip the tent and step outside. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Or maybe they weren't alone. Whatever the reason, they knew I was there. They knew I was alone, and they wanted me to come out. Since then, I still hike. I still go solo sometimes, but I'm more careful. I research the area better. I keep my GPS beacon on at night, not just in my pack. I don't camp too far from the trail, and I never, ever ignore that gut feeling that something's off. Because that night, the only thing that saved me was staying put. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stepped outside. I don't want to know. All I know is that there are people out there who do things like that. Not because they're crazy, not because they're supernatural, but because they can. Because deep in the woods, there are no rules. No cameras, no help, just you, alone, and whoever else might be watching. I'd been on the road for about 8 hours. The reunion was in California, somewhere near the Mojave. I left late because of work and figured I'd drive straight through the night. I was making good time, but once I crossed into the desert, the traffic thinned out fast. After a while, I didn't see any cars at all, just miles and miles of empty roads stretching out in front of me, the high beams cutting through the blackness like a tunnel of light. I had the windows cracked just enough to keep me from getting too comfortable. I didn't want to fall asleep behind the wheel. The warm desert air smelled like dust and dry brush. My music had long since turned into background noise, something soft just to fill the silence. The only other sounds were the steady hum of my tires on the road and the occasional creak from the dashboard. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I realized I was getting low on gas. The needle was flirting with empty, and I hadn't seen a station for at least 100 miles. I started to worry. I slowed down a little, turned off the AC to conserve fuel, even shut off the stereo. It felt like I was squeezing every last drop out of the tank, hoping I'd see something before the car gave up. Then, just when I was thinking I'd have to pull over and sleep in the car, I saw a glow on the horizon. It started as just a soft orange, like a star that had fallen and landed in the sand. As I got closer, I saw it was a small gas station, one of those single pump types of flat-roofed building with flickering fluorescent lights. There were no other cars, no sign of town nearby. Just that gas station sitting by itself like it had been dropped there out of nowhere. The sign said open 24 hours. I pulled in slow, the gravel crunching under my tires. The lights above the pump buzzed quietly. Inside, I could see a man behind the counter, not moving, just standing there. He looked old, skin like dried leather, white stubble, eyes glassy and a little too wide. He didn't blink when I walked in, just stared. I gave a quick wave, just being polite. Pump still work. He nodded. That's all. No smile, no, yeah, sure. Nothing. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a couple 20s, laid them on the counter. His hand came out slow and took the money without a word. Thanks, I said. Still nothing. It felt weird, but I didn't feel threatened or anything. Just off. Like maybe the guy wasn't all there. I figured he was half asleep or half senile or both. I walked back out, clicked the nozzle into the tank, and started pumping. The air was dead quiet. The buzzing from the light was the loudest thing around. No crickets, no wind. Just that low electric hum and the slow tick of gas filling the tank. Then the door creaked open behind me. I turned and saw the old man had stepped outside. He looked even smaller in the light, hunched a little, like the desert heat had baked him down over the years. He walked up slow, too close for comfort, and leaned in. I could smell him, old sweat and motor oil. Then, real quiet, he said, "Don't go to the bathroom. Just leave." That's it. No explanation. No change in his face. Just those words, flat and calm, like he was telling me the weather. Then he turned and walked right back inside. I stood there for a second, frozen. I watched him through the glass. He went back to standing behind the counter like he'd never moved. Didn't look at me again. Something about the way he said it. It wasn't panicked or dramatic. It was firm, final, and that made it worse. It felt real, like it was coming from someone who'd seen something too awful to explain. I should have listened. I know that now, but I was curious. And it was that quiet, dry kind of curiosity that makes you forget about consequences. The gas finished pumping, and I left the nozzle in for a second. Then I looked around the side of the building. There was a single door in the back, propped open with a cinder block. The bathroom, a bare yellow light bulb, was swinging overhead, barely lighting the space. The door creaked in the stillness. I shouldn't have gone near it, but I took a step, then another. When I got close enough to see inside, my stomach dropped. There was a man tied to a chair, duct tape across his mouth, shirtless, covered in sweat and dirt. His hands were bound behind him, ankles taped to the chair legs. His eyes were wide, wild. He jerked his head when he saw me, like he was trying to scream through the tape. His whole body trembled. I just stared at him. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The scene didn't make sense. It looked like something out of a movie, but too real, too raw. Then I heard something, a soft noise, maybe a footstep inside the building. I snapped out of it. I bolted back to my car, ripped the door open, and got inside. I didn't even close the gas tank flap. I floored it, gravel kicking up behind me as I tore back on a highway. The wheels screeched a little when I turned too sharp, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My heart was hammering. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights, someone chasing me. But the road behind me was black. I drove for maybe 30 miles before I saw the lights of a town. It wasn't big, just a cluster of buildings with a diner, a few houses, and a tiny sheriff's station. I pulled in and parked right in front of the station. Inside, there was a young deputy at the desk. I tried to explain what I saw, but the words came out jumbled. I was shaking. Finally, I just said, "There's a man tied up at that gas station. Back bathroom. He's alive." That got his attention. He called me unit, then made me sit down and go over everything again, slower. I told him about the gas station, the old man, what he whispered and what I saw. I gave them the location as best I could remember it. Mile markers, turns, the last highway sign I saw. 2 more officers came in, listened, and then the 3 of them left in a cruiser. I sat there for maybe an hour. They gave me water. I tried to stop my hands from shaking. The adrenaline was fading, and the fear started to settle in deep. My stomach hurt. My head was pounding. Then the cruiser came back. The older cop walked in, face hard. He looked tired already. "You sure this is the place?" he asked me. "Yeah, it's the only station out there. I swear." He nodded once. "We found it. Station's there. Lights were off. No cars. No people. Nobody inside. What about the bathroom?" He paused. "We found blood. A lot of it. On the floor. No chair. No man. No tape. Just blood. I didn't know what to say. My brain was trying to make it make sense, but it didn't. It couldn't. Somebody cleaned it out? He shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe whoever did it had help. Maybe they saw you and got spooked. I asked if they were going to search the area. He nodded. We'll send people out. Get state troopers, maybe dogs if we can. But we'll be honest with you. Out there, in the desert, whoever did this is probably long gone. They took my statement again, let me sit in the back of the station for a while. Eventually, the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just kept thinking about that man's eyes. The way he looked at me, like I was his last shot. I kept wondering if I should have done more. Untied him, gotten him out, but there was no way to know if someone else was there, if they were watching me. I left the next morning. They thanked me for coming forward, said they'd keep me updated. That was 3 years ago. I never heard back. I called once, a few weeks later. Got some woman who said the case was still open. That was it. I didn't push. Didn't want to. I didn't want to be part of it anymore. I just wanted to forget. But I still think about it, especially at night, when it's quiet and dark and I can't sleep. I think about that gas station, that man's eyes, and the way the old guy whispered to me. Sometimes I wonder, if he hadn't warned me, would I have walked in there? Would I have disappeared too? I don't drive at night anymore, not through the desert, and I always fill up before I go. We thought renting a cabin in the woods would be a great way to get away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work and school. My wife, our 2 daughters, and I packed the car and drove about 3 hours out to a remote area that promised quiet, nature, and a break from screens and calls. The place looked great in the pictures the owner had sent. It was a small wooden cabin set in a clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The owner said it was peaceful, off the grid enough to unplug, but still with some basic amenities. We imagined long hikes, campfires, and board games by the fireplace. The drive was smooth, winding through narrow roads flanked by dense forest. The closer we got, the more isolated the surroundings became. I remember the air smelled fresher, cooler, and the light seemed softer, filtered through the tree canopy. We pulled up to the cabin just before sunset, the sky a mix of orange and purple. The cabin was older but sturdy, with a small porch, a woodpile neatly stacked by the side, and windows glowing with warm light inside. It had a rustic charm, and the girls were immediately excited. We unpacked, lit a fire in the stone hearth, and prepared dinner. The girls ran outside to chase fireflies while my wife and I set up the table. After we ate, we settled in to relax. I tried to check my phone for signal and noticed only one bar, barely enough to load anything. My wife's phone was worse, no service at all. The younger one, Emma, had a different carrier and somehow got a tiny bit of signal, maybe 1 or 2 bars, but no real connection. We told the girls to enjoy the moment, that this was our chance to unplug. No work emails, no social media, no calls. That first night, the silence was almost too much. The forest sounds were everywhere. The crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, but no human voices, no cars. The cabin creaked as the wood settled and the wind pushed against the windows. It felt good in a way, calming. I lay awake for a while listening to the quiet. We had all agreed to leave our phones off the first night to enjoy the unplugged experience. The next day, we explored the area. There was a small trail that led into the woods, not marked but clearly walked often enough. The girls found a shallow stream where they skipped stones and tried to catch tadpoles with their hands. My wife and I talked about how nice it was to be away, how much the girls needed this break. We didn't see another person or house for hours. I tried calling the owner to ask about the landline in case of emergency, but the call didn't go through. Back at the cabin, I noticed a dusty old landline phone on a small table near the kitchen. It looked unused, the cord tangled and faded yellow. I picked it up and listened. There was no dial tone. I mentioned it to the owner when she stopped by the next afternoon to drop off firewood and check if we needed anything. She was a woman in her 60s, with a friendly but tired smile. "That phone's been dead for months," she said, her voice low. "No one's fixed the line because there's no real need anymore. No neighbors close by, and most people use their cell phones. But out here, cell service is patchy at best. You'll be lucky to get a bar. I nodded, feeling a little uneasy but thankful for the warning. She told us there were no other cabins within several miles, and that the closest town was at least an hour's drive back the way we came. She promised to check on us again before the weekend ended and left with a wave. That evening, after dinner, the girls were playing a board game by the fire while my wife and I cleaned up. Emma's phone, which had been mostly silent all day, suddenly rang. It was a strange sound, a harsh, ragged breathing coming through the speaker. There was no caller ID, just a blank screen. Emma jumped, dropping the phone on the floor with a surprised yelp. The room went quiet. I picked up the phone and stared at the screen, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I answered it, half expecting silence or a prank, but there was only silence. No voice, no background noise, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. I tried to hold the phone steady, listening. Then the breathing started again, rough, ragged, close. I told Emma to bring me the cabin phone. I wanted to see if maybe the landline could give us any clue or connection. She fetched the old phone, and I tried dialing my own cell. Nothing. No tone, no connection. I listened carefully and realized there was no dial tone either. It was as dead as the day the owner had said. I tested the line a few more times, just to be sure, but it was useless. The girls were now nervous, sitting closer to my wife. I reassured them as best I could that it was probably just some glitch or a wrong number, maybe some prank from cell towers out of range. Still, I felt an odd cold sinking in my chest. Something about that breath on the phone had been wrong. Too deliberate, too heavy to be random. That night, I double-checked the locks and peered out the windows. The forest was dark and still. I thought I saw a shadow move behind the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. The girls slept fitfully, and I stayed awake a while longer, listening to every crack and snap. The next day passed slowly. We kept close to the cabin, making sure the girls didn't wander too far. The cell service remained spotty. I could barely send a text to work to say I might be out of contact for the next few days. When the owner returned to pick us up, I asked her again about the phone and the strange call. She looked at me for a long moment before admitting the phone line had been dead for months. She said she hadn't mentioned it earlier because no one usually tried to use it. Also, she warned us that no one else lived close by. No neighbors, no passing hikers, nothing. She looked serious then, her usual friendly smile gone. You're really far out here. If you need help, you have to drive into town. There's no emergency service coming this way fast. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The silence around the cabin, the dead phone, the strange call, it all added up to one thing. Out here, we were on our own. No instant help, no quick rescue. We packed up the next morning with an extra sense of urgency. The girls were quiet, clinging a little more to my wife's side as we loaded the car. The woods seemed darker somehow, less inviting. The road back was long, and the cell signals slowly came back as we drove, the city noises creeping back in. I kept the phone call in my mind, the ragged breathing that came out of nowhere. Whatever it was a warning. A reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, you're never truly out of reach of something you can't control. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see or hear, but the silence that follows. When our daughter was born, our world shrunk down to her. Every moment, every breath, every sound revolved around this tiny person who had completely taken over our lives. My wife and I were exhausted, like every new parent, but in that foggy haze of sleep deprivation, there was something almost beautiful about how much we cared. We live in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, with nothing but a narrow strip of woods behind it, and a row of modest homes stretching down the block. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, and it felt safe. When she was around 3 months old, we started using a baby monitor. It was one of those audio-only ones, not the fancy video kind. A small white plastic unit sat on her dresser, and the receiver sat on the nightstand next to my side of the bed. It had a green light that flickered when sound came through and a red one when it was loud enough. It worked well. We could hear her stir or cry without having to constantly get up to check. It gave us a little peace of mind during those long nights. That night started out like any other. I was lying in bed, barely awake, reading something pointless on my phone, and my wife was already out cold. The monitor was quiet. She'd gone down earlier than usual after a long day of fussing, and I was grateful. The green light blinked a little, soft static whispering through the speaker every now and then, but nothing that stood out. It was probably close to midnight when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I had the volume low, just enough to hear if she cried, but suddenly it sounded like someone was talking. Not loud, not clear, just this faint, garbled murmur. My first thought was that it was feedback or maybe picking up some random signal. These monitors weren't exactly high-tech. I reached over and turned the volume up slightly. What I heard wasn't clear enough to make out words, not at first. It was like someone was trying to speak low, maybe even right next to the monitor. A weird mix of breathing and muttering. I sat up, straining to hear, feeling this weird pinch of tension in my chest. I looked over at my wife, who hadn't stirred. The whispering continued, just on the edge of clarity. I stood up slowly, not really knowing why I was moving so cautiously. Then I heard it, clear as day. A voice. A man's voice, low and calm, almost gentle in tone. "Don't look at me. Just go back to sleep." That was it. One line, but it hit me so hard I stopped breathing for a moment. The tone wasn't threatening, exactly. It wasn't loud or angry or even mocking. It was calm, quiet, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. My first instinct was to run straight to her room, but something held me back. Not fear exactly, not yet. Confusion maybe. My brain was trying to make sense of what I just heard. Had I imagined it? Had I dozed off for a second and dreamed it? I stood in the dark of our bedroom, heart pounding, staring at the little white box on the nightstand. Nothing but soft static now. No voice, no whisper, no words. I looked at my wife again, now breathing heavily, deep asleep. I didn't wake her. I moved quickly but quietly through the hallway and stopped at the door to our daughter's room. It was open just a crack, the soft glow of the nightlight seeping out around the frame. I pushed it open slowly. Her room was exactly as it had been. Her crib was just beneath the window, the curtains drawn closed. The dresser, the glider in the corner, the changing table, all untouched. She was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in that steady rhythm babies have when they're truly out. I stood there for a long time, staring into the room, listening for anything. A creak, a shift, a breath, but there was nothing. I walked in. I didn't turn on a light. I just went to her crib and looked down at her. She looked so peaceful, so unaware. I bent down to check that the monitor was still on. The green light blinked softly. It was working fine. I picked it up and turned it off. Just like that. I didn't put it back on again. I carried it back into our room and unplugged the receiver. I put both parts in the hall closet and shut the door. When I climbed back into bed, my wife stirred for a second, just enough to shift her weight, then settled back into sleep. I lay there for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of our house. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, the occasional car passing on the street outside. Morning came slow. I hadn't slept, not really. My wife noticed right away. "You look like crap," she said, pouring coffee. "I didn't sleep well," I said. I didn't mention the voice. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I figured maybe I had imagined it. The mind plays tricks when you're tired. She noticed the monitor was gone. Did the monitor break? No, just didn't like the static, I said. Felt like it kept me awake. She shrugged and didn't press. For the next few nights, I didn't sleep well. I kept checking her room every few hours, standing in the doorway, listening, watching. Nothing was ever out of place. She kept sleeping soundly through the night. There were no more voices, no more whispers, nothing strange. A week later, I finally told my wife. Not the full story, not at first. I told her I thought I'd heard a voice over the monitor, maybe interference from a neighbor's baby unit or some kind of walkie-talkie signal. She frowned, but didn't seem overly concerned. She did say, "That's weird," but then brushed it off. We live close enough to other houses. Things bleed through walls. Radios pick up weird things. That was enough for her, but not for me. That line, asterisk, "Don't look at me. Just go back to sleep," asterisk, kept playing over and over in my head. There was something off about it. The words themselves weren't the scary part. It was the idea that they were directed at someone. Not random, not broadcasted noise. It felt personal, like the person knew someone was listening. I started thinking about it constantly. During the day, at work, in the shower. I'd stand outside her room sometimes and just listen, heart racing for no reason. I started checking all the locks at night, more than once. I moved furniture in front of the back door. I bought a small motion light and set it up on the back deck facing the woods. My wife asked what was going on. I told her I was just being careful. New dad paranoia. She accepted that too easily, and I let her. But inside I was running through every possibility. Was someone in our house that night? No, that didn't make sense. Nothing was missing. There were no signs of entry. No open windows. The monitor unit was in the room the whole time, and I checked her room right after I heard the voice. There was no one there. Could someone have been outside her window? It was possible. The monitor was on the dresser, just a few feet from the window. If someone had stood right outside, maybe their voice could have carried in. But we kept the window closed at night. Always. It was early spring and still chilly most nights. Plus, her room was on the side of the house, not the back. It faced the side yard, with a direct line to our neighbor's fence. I checked the grass outside the next day. There was nothing. No footprints. No signs anyone had stood there. The dirt near the base of the window was undisturbed. I even checked under the shrubs. Nothing. Could have been a neighbor's monitor bleeding into ours? I suppose so, but the words were so clear, and the tone was so specific. I still don't know why that part disturbed me so much. Maybe because I felt something in it. Not anger, not even menace. Just something cold, like disinterest, like whoever said it didn't care if they were heard, or maybe hoped they were. After 2 weeks, I threw the monitor away, not just in the kitchen trash. I drove it to the dump and threw it into one of the bins myself. I didn't want it in the house anymore. My wife was confused, but by then she had learned to just accept my quirks. She figured I was being overly cautious, maybe even a little too wound up by being a new parent. But I kept waking up at odd hours. I started sleeping with a flashlight under my pillow and a small crowbar by the bed. I'd walk the perimeter of the house every night before going to sleep. I installed a cheap security camera by the front and back doors. Nothing ever showed up. Nothing ever happened. Eventually, the feeling faded. Not all at once. Little by little. My daughter got older. She started sleeping through the night. We stopped tiptoeing around. We relaxed. And then, a couple months later, I was out mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. It was warm, and I was sweating, half distracted, just trying to get the job done. I had earbuds and listening to a podcast, and wasn't really paying attention. I came around the side of the house, near her room, and something caught my eye near the window. It was a small piece of clear tape, stuck to the bottom of the frame. Not something you'd notice right away, but in the sun it caught the light. I bent down and looked closer. There was something else there, a thin black wire. It had been tucked along the frame edge, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I pulled at it. It gave easily. It had been cut. I followed it down, tracing it through the bushes. It had been buried shallowly in the dirt, leading around the side of the house and ending just short of the fence. It wasn't live. It was old. The cut ends were frayed and rusted, but it had been there. Someone had run a wire to that window.